There are details buried inside Pokemon that most players will never notice, and the ones who do find them often have trouble explaining why they feel so significant. The world of Pokemon is built on layers, and most of those layers were never meant to be seen. They exist in the spaces between what is shown and what is simply known, quiet architecture holding up everything familiar. And somewhere in that architecture, if you look long enough and with the right kind of patience, you begin to find the things that change the way you see the whole. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The Pokemon franchise began not as the enormous global institution it is today, but as a small and deeply personal project conceived by a young man named Satoshi Tajiri. He spent his childhood catching insects near his home in Machida, a city on the outskirts of Tokyo, and as development consumed that landscape, he wanted to preserve the feeling of that pursuit in a form that could survive the concrete. The game he eventually created was not an action title or a story-driven adventure in the traditional sense. It was a simulation of curiosity itself, of reaching into tall grass and not knowing what would emerge. Tajiri spent 6 years developing the original Pokemon Red and Green, nearly bankrupting Game Freak in the process. There were moments when the team was small enough to fit in a single room, and members worked without pay for extended periods because they believed in what they were making. The game sold modestly in Japan at first, and Nintendo was uncertain enough about its overseas potential that the Western release of Pokemon Red and Blue was delayed by nearly 2 years after the Japanese launch. What happened after that delay is now a matter of history, but the fragility of that beginning is something worth holding on to. The original 151 Pokemon were not designed in isolation. They were conceived as part of an interconnected ecosystem, each creature placed within a web of relationships that extended beyond simple type matchups. Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori built the roster with a kind of ecological logic, imagining which creatures would hunt, which would coexist, and which would form the kind of symbiotic bonds that real species do in the wild. That ecological thinking became the foundation for every generation that followed, even when it was stretched far beyond its original scope. Ken Sugimori, the lead artist who drew every original Pokemon by hand, used watercolor paints for the official artwork of the first generation. He created each design with a deliberate softness, wanting the creatures to feel organic and tactile rather than sharp and mechanical. The original art style carried a warmth that was slightly out of step with the trends of the time, but that warmth became one of the franchise's most enduring qualities. Players who grew up with those designs carry a specific texture of nostalgia, tied directly to the way Sugimori's brushstrokes moved. The very first Pokemon ever designed is not who most players would guess. Long before Pikachu became the face of the franchise, and before Raiden became the mascot of early development builds, the creative process began with concepts rather than finished designs. The image that is often cited as the very first complete Pokemon design in the development record belongs to Raiden, whose silhouette appeared in early promotional materials and test builds in a way that gave it a kind of unofficial primacy. Raiden's statue appears at the entrance of gyms in the original games, a small tribute to its foundational position in the history of the series. Pikachu was not originally intended to be the franchise mascot. That role was filled by Clefairy in early planning stages, and the original anime was conceived with Clefairy as Ash's primary partner. The reasoning was sound from a design perspective. Clefairy was pink, round, and universally appealing in the way that small, soft creatures tend to be. But focus group testing and internal discussions shifted the choice toward Pikachu, partly because of the character's visual distinctiveness, and partly because the yellow coloring made Pikachu stand out more clearly on screen and in merchandise. The decision changed the shape of everything that followed. The electric mouse Pokemon's name carries more history than its cheerful appearance suggests. Pikachu is a compound of two Japanese sound words. Pika refers to the crackling sound of electricity, and Chu is the sound a mouse makes in Japanese. The name is therefore a small, onomatopoeic portrait, a creature whose very identity is encoded in the sounds associated with what it is. This kind of layered naming is something Game Freak returned to again and again across the generations, building names that function as descriptions, references, and sounds all at once. The starters of the original generation were designed around a specific rock-paper-scissors balance that has since become one of the franchise's most foundational design principles. Fire beats grass, grass beats water, and water beats fire. But the original trio of Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle was also designed with a secondary layer of intention. Bulbasaur was created to be the easiest choice for new players, as its grass and poison typing gave it advantages in the first two gyms. Charmander was the hardest starting experience, a deliberate challenge for players who chose the design they found most visually exciting. Squirtle fell in the middle, a comfortable middle path between accessibility and difficulty. Bulbasaur holds a specific distinction that players rarely stop to consider. As the first Pokémon in the National Pokedex, Bulbasaur is simultaneously the most overlooked starter and the one with the most logical claim to primacy in the numbering system. Its dual grass and poison typing was unique at the time of release, and Venusaur, its final evolution, remains one of a small number of grass and poison type Pokémon in the franchise's history. The flower that blooms on Venusaur's back is described in the Pokedex as capable of capturing sunlight so effectively that it can sustain the Pokémon even during long periods without food. Charmander's Pokedex entry contains a detail that became one of the franchise's most discussed pieces of lore. The flame at the tip of its tail burns from birth, and if that flame were to go out, the Pokémon would die. This detail is not referenced again in the games in any mechanical way, but it lodged itself in the imagination of an entire generation of players. The flame grows larger and burns more intensely when Charmander is in good health, and it sputters in rain or when the Pokémon is weakened. It is a small piece of world building that gives the creature a vulnerability completely absent from its stats and battle performance. Squirtle's design contains a visual reference that not every player catches. The shape of its shell is modeled partly on a traditional Japanese tortoiseshell pattern, a hexagonal geometric design that carries deep cultural associations with longevity and protection. The choice to use that pattern grounded Squirtle within a specific visual tradition while still making the design feel like something new. The sunglasses that the Squirtle squad wears in the original anime were not in the games, but became so associated with the character that they eventually found their way into official merchandise and later game appearances. The decision to give each starter Pokémon a 3-stage evolution line was not always a given. Early development documents suggest that the team experimented with different structures, including lines that ended at 2 stages and concepts that had branching evolutions depending on how the player trained their Pokémon. The 3-stage structure that was eventually settled on gave each starter a clear arc of growth, allowing players to form a relationship with a small, approachable creature and watch it transform into something powerful and distinct over the course of the game. That emotional arc became one of the pillars of the franchise's lasting appeal. The Pokedex itself, the in-world device that catalogs and describes Pokémon, has entries that range from warmly informative to genuinely unsettling. Some entries describe behaviors and physical capabilities that would be catastrophic if the creatures in question existed in the real world. Hypno is described in its Pokedex entries across multiple games as a Pokémon that has been known to hypnotize and carry away children who catch its eye. Gengar's entry mentions that it lurks in the shadows of bedrooms on cold nights, waiting to drain the warmth from sleeping people. These darker edges were built into the games from the very beginning, a quietly adult texture woven into what appeared to be a children's franchise. The Ghost-type Pokémon of the original generation, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, were all immune to normal and fighting-type moves, a fact that created one of the most famous oversights in the original games. Psychic-type Pokémon were described as being weak to Ghost-type attacks, but because every Ghost-type move in the original games was normal-type in terms of how the code processed its damage, Ghost-type attacks actually did no damage to Psychic types at all. The relationship was inverted from what the game described. Psychic Pokémon in Generation 1 were therefore only truly vulnerable to Bug-type moves, and Bug types in that era were generally among the weakest available, making Psychic types functionally dominant in competitive play. The Psychic type's dominance in Generation 1 was so complete that competitive players of that era built their teams around a small number of Pokémon, primarily Alakazam, Starmie, and Jolteon, whose combination of high speed and strong special stats made them extraordinarily difficult to counter. Alakazam, in particular, had a special stat so high that very few Pokémon in the game could survive a direct hit from Psychic. The mechanic that made this possible, the single combined special stat that functioned as both special attack and special defense, was not split into two separate values until Generation 2. That split fundamentally changed the way the game could be balanced. Mewtwo, the most powerful Pokémon in the original game, was created through genetic manipulation of Mew's DNA, and the records of that process are preserved in journals found in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. Reading those journal entries in sequence tells a story of scientific ambition crossing into something darker, a project begun with curiosity that ends with the subject destroying its creators. The journals are numbered out of sequence, and finding them all requires exploring the Pokémon Mansion thoroughly. Many players miss them entirely on their first playthrough, encountering Mewtwo at the end of Cerulean Cave without the context that those pages provide. Mew was added to the original game by programmer Shigeki Morimoto without the knowledge of most of the development team. The game was nearly complete, and Morimoto found 256 unused bytes in the code, which was exactly enough space to add a new Pokémon. He programmed Mew in secret during the final weeks of development, and the addition was not discovered until the game was already being prepared for distribution. Because there was no time to add a legitimate in-game method of obtaining it, Mew remained technically inaccessible through normal play, available only through official Nintendo events. This scarcity transformed Mew into something approaching mythology for players of that generation. The Mew glitch, discovered years after the game's release, allowed players to encounter and catch Mew through a sequence of very specific actions involving the youngster just south of Cerulean City, the Slowpoke above Nugget Bridge, and a precise use of the fly move. The glitch works because of how the game handles memory when certain events interrupt others, and the level of understanding required to discover and document it is remarkable given the tools available to players at the time. The person most often credited with the glitch's discovery was a teenager who shared the method on an early internet forum, and the technique spread rapidly through the global Pokémon community before being officially acknowledged. The Safari Zone in the original games contained a hidden mechanic that most players never understood. The items obtainable there, including the HM for Surf and the gold teeth needed to obtain strength, were placed in a way that required players to either walk a very precise path or get extremely lucky with random movement. The Pokémon available in the Safari Zone had catch rates tied to a hidden counter rather than to the standard catch rate system used elsewhere in the game, and the throwing of bait and rocks affected escape rates in ways that seemed counterintuitive. Many players developed strong personal theories about the best strategy, and most of those theories were at least partially incorrect. The HM system, which required Pokémon to learn specific moves in order to navigate the overworld, was one of the most significant and eventually most criticized design decisions in the early games. HMs could not be forgotten through normal means, requiring a specific NPC in Generation 2 onward to remove them, and this created situations where players felt pressured to dedicate roster slots to HM users who were otherwise not useful in battle. The system persisted across 7 generations before being replaced in Pokémon Sun and Moon by the Ride Pager, which allowed players to call on specific Pokémon to perform field navigation tasks without needing to carry them in their party. The introduction of held items in Pokémon Gold and Silver was one of the most significant expansions of the game's mechanical depth up to that point. Held items allowed Pokémon to carry objects that modified their combat performance, and the additions of type-enhancing items, status-curing berries, and the iconic Leftovers item opened up strategic layers that the original games had not anticipated. The Leftovers item in particular, which restores a small amount of HP each turn, changed the way defensive play worked and made stalling strategies viable in competitive settings in a way they had not been before. Gold and Silver introduced breeding, a mechanic that fundamentally changed the relationship between players and their Pokémon. For the first time, players could produce eggs by leaving compatible Pokémon at the daycare, and the offspring would hatch with a moveset that could include moves the parent knew, but that the young Pokémon could not learn by leveling up on its own. These were called egg moves, and they immediately became a layer of deep investment for players interested in competitive play, creating families of Pokémon whose value was tied not just to their stats, but to the specific moves passed down through breeding chains. The daycare in the original Gold and Silver had a specific mechanical quirk that has followed the franchise through multiple generations. Pokémon left in the daycare would gain experience and level up over time, but the moves they learned through leveling would replace existing moves in a way that the player had no control over. It was entirely possible to collect a Pokémon from the daycare and discover that a move you had carefully trained was gone, replaced by something learned at a higher level. This created a persistent, low-level anxiety around the daycare that many players remember vividly. The act of checking what had changed becoming a small ritual at the start of each visit. The individual values system, known to the community as IVs, was present in the original games as a hidden numerical framework that determined how high each of a Pokémon's stats could grow. Each stat had a hidden value between 0 and 15 in the original generation, and these values were fixed at the moment the Pokémon was encountered. Players had no way to see these values directly in the early games, and the only way to calculate them accurately was through a long process of raising the Pokémon to level 100 and comparing its final stats against known formulas. The existence of this system was documented by dedicated members of the competitive community years before it was officially acknowledged. Effort values, known as Eevees, formed the second hidden layer of stat development in the Pokémon games. Every Pokémon that a player defeated contributed effort points to specific stats, and these points accumulated to produce stat boosts at level 100. The system existed in the original games, but was largely invisible, with no in-game documentation and no way to see the current totals. Players who understood and intentionally manipulated Eevee training had a significant advantage in competitive play, but the system was complex enough that most players never engaged with it deliberately. It was not until later generations that visual indicators were added to let players track their Pokémon's effort value progress directly. The shiny Pokémon system, which allows for alternate color variants of any species to appear with extremely low probability, was introduced in Generation 2 entirely by accident. When the Gold and Silver development team was implementing the data for Pokemon sprites, they included a variable that determined the color palette to be used for each individual Pokemon. Because each Pokemon had a unique combination of stats that was essentially a fingerprint, certain combinations happened to map to a different color palette. The red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage was therefore not planned in advance as a set encounter, but rather emerged from the developers recognizing what the system could produce and building a narrative reason for it. The probability of encountering a shiny Pokemon in the original Gold and Silver was approximately 1 in 8,192. This number was not arbitrary. It was determined by the architecture of the hidden value system used at the time, in which the probability of a given combination of values producing a shiny coloration was precisely that fraction. When the shiny hunting community began to form, players quickly calculated this number, and it became one of the most widely known statistics in all of Pokemon culture. The number persisted across generations until the 6th generation, when a game mechanic called the Masuda method and various in-game items began to lower the odds. The Masuda method is named after Junichi Masuda, the Pokemon composer and director who programmed it into the Generation 4 games. The mechanic increases the probability of producing a shiny Pokemon through breeding when the two Pokemon left in the daycare come from games with different language settings. The reasoning behind the mechanic was to reward international trading and to celebrate the global nature of the Pokemon community. Masuda implemented it quietly, without any in-game announcement, and his discovery came through players noticing unexpectedly high shiny rates from their international breeding pairs and sharing the observation online. The legendary Pokemon Celebi, introduced in Gold and Silver, was entirely inaccessible through normal gameplay in the Western release of those games. The method of obtaining it in Japan required a special device called the Pokemon Mobile System GB, a peripheral that connected the Game Boy Color to a mobile phone network that was never deployed outside Japan. Western players who wanted Celebi had to wait for official Nintendo events, which were rare and geographically limited. The result was that Celebi remained one of the most sought-after and culturally significant Pokemon of its generation, known to nearly every player but owned by very few. Pokemon Crystal was the first game in the franchise to introduce a playable female protagonist, a decision that came after years of player feedback requesting the option. The female protagonist in Crystal, known as Chris in some markets, was designed with a different visual style from the male protagonist Gold, and her inclusion was met with widespread positive response from the community. The design team noted that the addition had been considered for Gold and Silver, but had been deferred due to time and space constraints on the cartridge, a recurring limitation that shaped many decisions in the early era of the franchise. The Pokemon games have always contained a layer of in-world lore that players who read carefully are rewarded for engaging with. In Gold and Silver, the story of the Slowpoke in Azalea Town and the conflict with Team Rocket is presented as a local news event that the player stumbles into, a small crisis with real emotional stakes before the larger conflict of the game has even begun. The Slowpoke were being captured and mutilated for their tails, which were sold as a luxury food item. For a franchise aimed at children, this was a surprisingly direct engagement with themes of exploitation and economic harm, presented without softening. The gym leader Claire of Blackthorn City became famous among players for being the only gym leader who refuses to hand over their badge immediately upon defeat. After losing, Claire insists that the player complete the Dragon's Den challenge before she will acknowledge their victory, a decision that frustrated many players, but also made Claire one of the most memorable and discussed gym leaders in the franchise's history. The behavior is never explained in any way that satisfies, and revisiting it as an adult player produces a different kind of unease, a small portrait of someone who cannot accept loss gracefully. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is one of the franchise's most atmospherically effective locations. It is a gravesite for Pokémon, filled with the spirits of creatures who have died, and the sound design and visual presentation work together to create a genuinely unsettling environment within what is otherwise a brightly colored adventure game. The ghost that blocks the upper floors, which is revealed to be the spirit of a Marowak murdered by Team Rocket, is one of the most emotionally specific plot points in the original games, a grief-shaped obstacle that can only be resolved by confronting the story directly. The Lavender Town music became the subject of an enduring and well-documented piece of internet mythology known as the Lavender Town Syndrome, which claimed that the original Japanese version of the music contained high-frequency tones that caused distress in children. The creepypasta surrounding this story grew elaborate over time, with fabricated statistics and false reports of children becoming ill from listening to the theme. The actual frequency range of the original music was within normal human hearing and produced no documented medical effects. But the story persists because the music genuinely is unsettling in a way that is difficult to fully articulate, particularly within the context of the rest of the game. The connection between Pokémon and Japanese culture runs far deeper than most Western players recognize. The map of the Kanto region is directly modeled on the Kanto region of Japan, with cities and routes arranged in a way that mirrors the real geography. Pallet Town corresponds roughly to Satoshi Tajiri's actual hometown, and the path from there northward through the game mirrors the routes Tajiri walked as a child. The towns of the Johto region correspond to cities in the Kansai region of Japan, a culturally distinct area known for its historical depth and traditional character, which is reflected in Johto's more myth-laden atmosphere compared to the technological focus of Kanto. The Hoenn region, introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, was inspired by the island of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, which is characterized by its warm climate, volcanic activity, and coastal geography. The prominence of water routes in Hoenn is a direct reflection of Kyushu's island character, and the volcanic themes of the Weather Trio and the presence of Lavender Town near an active volcanic site mirror the real volcanic character of the region. Game Freak's designers visited Kyushu during the development of Ruby and Sapphire to gather reference material for the environment. The Weather Trio of Hoenn, consisting of Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, introduced a new kind of legendary narrative to the franchise. Rather than a single godlike figure at the center of the story, Ruby and Sapphire presented two ancient forces locked in eternal conflict, with a third entity whose role was to maintain equilibrium between them. This triangular structure created a more nuanced mythological framework than the single antagonist model of the original games, and it influenced the design of legendary trios in subsequent generations. The relationship between the three was later expanded significantly in the remakes Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Groudon and Kyogre are described in the Pokedex and in in-game lore as being so ancient that they predate recorded history. Their battle in the distant past is said to have been responsible for shaping the land masses and oceans of the world, a creation myth embedded within a handheld game. The Ruby and Sapphire storyline positions the player not as the hero defeating evil, but as a small actor in a conflict between natural forces so large that human-made organizations are almost irrelevant to them. Team Magma and Team Aqua are ultimately portrayed as having catastrophically misunderstood the things they were trying to control. The battle frontier introduced in Pokémon Emerald is often cited by the competitive community as the most challenging post-game content in the franchise's history. The facility consisted of 7 different battle facilities, each with its own rules, format, and powerful AI trainer who waited at the end of a winning streak. The facility designers deliberately built teams intended to counter the most commonly used competitive strategies, creating a challenge that required not just strong Pokémon, but deep understanding of the game's mechanical systems. The battle frontier was later simplified or removed in subsequent games, and its absence became a recurring source of discussion in the community. The frontier brain Annabelle from the original Emerald Battle Frontier reappeared decades later in Pokémon Sun and Moon as a member of the International Police, working alongside the in-game detective figure Looker. Her reappearance was treated as a significant narrative event and confirmed for longtime players that the characters from earlier games existed in a shared, continuous universe. The emotional weight of seeing a character from a decade-old game return in a new context, older and shaped by experiences the player never witnessed, is a specific kind of feeling that the Pokémon franchise produces more deliberately than it is often given credit for. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl introduced the Sinnoh region, which was based on the island of Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands. Hokkaido is characterized by its colder climate, mountainous terrain, and relative remoteness from the cultural centers of Japan, all of which are reflected in Sinnoh's mountainous geography and its mythology, which centers on creation itself. The legendary Pokémon of Sinnoh are described in terms of time, space, and antimatter, an unusually abstract framework for a franchise that had previously anchored its legendary lore in more concrete natural phenomena. Arceus, the mythical Pokémon said to have created the Sinnoh universe, holds a unique mechanical distinction within the franchise. It has the highest base stat total of any Pokémon, sharing that position only with specific forms of other legendary Pokémon, and its ability multi-type allows it to change its type by holding a corresponding plate item. This means that Arceus is simultaneously the Pokémon with the most extensive type coverage potential and the most narrative significance, combining mechanical dominance with in-world theological centrality. It is, within the logic of the games, as close to a god figure as the franchise has produced. The Hall of Origin, a location where Arceus was intended to be obtained through an event item called the Azure Flute, was programmed fully into Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, but was never unlocked through any official event. The Azure Flute was never distributed to players, meaning that the Hall of Origin has been reachable only through hacking or save manipulation. Players who have accessed it through these means describe a brief staircase of light, leading to Arceus standing alone in a white void, a sequence so minimal and atmospheric that the decision to never officially release it has become one of the franchise's most discussed mysteries. The time mechanic in Diamond and Pearl was tied to the real-world clock of the Nintendo DS system, which meant that certain events, such as specific wild Pokémon appearances and the evolution of Eevee into Espeon or Umbreon, occurred only at specific times of day or night. This connection between the game world and the actual time created a relationship between the player's daily schedule and their Pokémon's development that no previous generation had established. Players who wanted to evolve specific Pokémon during nighttime hours had to either stay up late or adjust their DS clock, the latter of which was considered by some members of the community to be a mild form of cheating. The Pokémon Rotom, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, was initially available only in one specific location, the Old Chateau in Eterna Forest, and only between the hours of 8 in the evening and 4 in the morning on the in-game clock. This combination of location specificity and time restriction made Rotom one of the most discussed, optional encounters of the generation. Rotom's later ability to possess household appliances and change its type accordingly made it one of the most mechanically versatile Pokémon in the franchise, and its evolution from a mysterious ghost encountered in an abandoned building to a cheerful multi-purpose electric appliance is one of the franchise's more unexpected character trajectories. The National Pokedex completion reward has changed across generations, but the act of completing it has remained one of the most discussed optional goals in the franchise. In the original games, the reward was a diploma and an encounter with Game Freak director Morimoto, an acknowledgement that completing the Pokedex was an extraordinary achievement, worthy of direct recognition from the people who made the game. This tradition of placing developer characters inside the games as a form of personal address to the most dedicated players is one of the franchise's quieter gestures of respect toward its community. Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes of Gold and Silver, released for the Nintendo DS, contained what many consider the single most impressive optional feature in any Pokémon game. The Pokewalker was a small pedometer device shaped like a Pokeball that allowed players to transfer a single Pokémon into the device and carry it with them throughout their day. Steps taken in the real world translated into watts within the device, which could be used to explore small virtual routes and catch Pokémon that could then be transferred back to the DS game. The Pokémon inside the Pokewalker would gradually become happier the more steps were taken, and the device's simple pixelated display showed the creature walking alongside a small representation of the player. The Pokewalker routes included some Pokémon that could not be obtained through any other means in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, making the device not just a charming peripheral, but a functionally significant part of the game's content. This made the Pokewalker's discontinuation, which followed the end of official support for the device, a quiet loss for completionists. Players who had left Pokémon inside Pokewalkers and later tried to retrieve them found that the transfer function no longer worked through official channels, leaving those Pokémon in a kind of digital limbo. The community eventually developed workarounds, but the situation became a small symbol of the impermanence of physical gaming hardware. The Sinnoh game's mythology is among the deepest in the franchise, with in-game texts called the Sinnoh myth, presenting a creation narrative involving Arceus awakening in a void, creating the universe, and then retreating to sleep. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf were said to have emerged from the same egg as the world itself, and their domains of knowledge, emotion, and willpower were described as the three components of human consciousness. This framework is unusually philosophical for a game aimed at young players, and the depth of its mythological structure continues to reward close reading decades after the game's release. The Unova region, introduced in Pokémon Black and White, was the first mainline region explicitly modeled on an American city rather than a Japanese location. New York City, specifically the borough of Manhattan, served as the visual and structural template for the urban design of Unova. The bridges, the density of buildings, the Central Park equivalent, and the overall layout of Castalia City all reflect elements of the Manhattan streetscape. The decision to set a Pokémon game in a non-Japanese environment was a significant departure from the franchise's established practice, and it gave Black and White a visual character unlike any previous generation. Pokémon Black and White also made a deliberate design decision that remains unique in the franchise. The regional Pokedex was restricted entirely to new Pokémon. Players could not encounter or use Pokémon from previous generations until after completing the main story. This decision was made to allow new players to experience the game without prior knowledge, and to give the new designs space to establish their own identities without being overshadowed by familiar favorites. The reaction within the community was divided, with some players appreciating the freshness and others feeling isolated from the creatures they had spent years training. The narrative of Pokémon Black and White engaged with themes of identity, freedom, and the ethics of keeping Pokémon in a more direct way than any previous main series game. The antagonist N, whose full name Natural Harmonia Gropius reflects the game's themes of natural versus artificial, was raised to believe that Pokemon and humans should be separated, that keeping Pokemon in balls was a form of imprisonment. His perspective is presented with enough sincerity that many players found themselves genuinely uncertain about whether he was wrong. This ambiguity was unprecedented in the franchise, and it established Black and White as the generation most willing to interrogate its own premises. The Pokemon Zorua and Zoroark, introduced in Black and White, required a transfer of specific event Pokemon from Heart Gold and Soul Silver to unlock their introductory encounters. This kind of cross-game connectivity was not new to the franchise, but the way it was implemented created a situation where players who had not participated in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver events could not access the content at all. The event distribution method used at the time required attendance at specific physical locations, and the Pokemon in question, a trio of shiny legendary beasts and a celebratory Celebus, were among the most sought-after distributions of their generation. The 5th generation also introduced triple battles and rotation battles, two new formats that expanded the possibilities of the core combat system significantly. Triple battles allowed 3 Pokemon on each side to fight simultaneously, with the position of each Pokemon affecting which targets it could attack and which moves it could use. Rotation battles placed 3 Pokemon on a turntable, with one facing forward at any time, and required players to anticipate which rotation would be most advantageous, without seeing the opponent's choice first. Both formats added genuine strategic depth, though neither became a staple of competitive play in the way the developers had perhaps hoped. The Kalos region, the setting for Pokémon X and Y, was based on France, and the attention to French cultural reference in its design is extensive. Lumiosa City is a faithful stylized recreation of Paris, with a tower at its center functioning as the region's navigational landmark, in the same way the Eiffel Tower anchors Paris's skyline. The routes and towns of Kalos reflect the French countryside and coast, and several in-game characters speak with verbal quirks that reference French conversational style. The decision to model the region on France, rather than Japan, reflected a growing awareness of the global audience for the franchise. Pokémon X and Y introduced Mega Evolution, a mechanic that allowed specific Pokémon holding corresponding stones to temporarily transform into more powerful forms during battle. The concept was presented within the story as a mysterious phenomenon unique to the Kalos region, tied to a legendary sacrifice that took place there 1,000 years in the past. The emotional weight of that backstory was delivered through the character AZ, an unnaturally tall and ancient man who had lived for over 3,000 years following the event, carrying his grief across time in a way that gave the Kalos region's mythology a personal scale that purely cosmic legendary narratives often lack. The specific Mega Evolutions introduced in X and Y were designed with the intention of giving new relevance to older Pokemon that had not been prominent in competitive play. Mega Kangaskhan, Mega Gengar, and Mega Garchomp all became fixtures of competitive formats almost immediately, and their dominance led to a rapid evolution of team-building strategies. Mega Kangaskhan's ability Parental Bond, which caused most attacks to hit twice, was one of the most discussed mechanics in competitive history, and it remained controversial throughout its time in the metagame due to its interaction with several other mechanics in ways that were difficult to counterplay. The global trade system in X and Y was expanded to include the Wonder Trade function, which allowed players to anonymously trade any Pokemon in their collection in exchange for a random Pokemon from another player anywhere in the world. The randomness of Wonder Trade created a distinctive culture around the feature. Players who sent recently hatched starter Pokemon, carefully bred competitive Pokemon, or rare event distributions were considered generous contributors to the community. Players who sent very common Pokemon were occasionally criticized, though the randomness of the system meant that any Wonder Trade could theoretically return something extraordinary. The Kalos region's underground revealed lore about an ancient war that had taken place in the region involving a weapon capable of draining the life force of Pokemon on a massive scale. This weapon, which the antagonist Lysandre attempted to use to eliminate everyone he considered unworthy of living in a beautiful world, was powered by a legendary Pokemon and had been used once before with catastrophic consequences. The game does not specify the scale of that previous use, and what it describes is genocide. This narrative thread in a mainline Pokemon game was among the darkest story elements in the franchise's history at that point. Pokemon Sun and Moon, set in the Alola region based on Hawaii, introduced regional variants of older Pokemon, forms that had adapted to the specific environmental conditions of the islands. This concept added significant depth to the Pokedex by acknowledging that species evolve differently in different environments, a concept grounded in real evolutionary biology. The Alolan forms often came with type changes and new visual designs that reflected their adapted environments, and they were immediately embraced by the community, both for their gameplay implications and for the storytelling they enabled about the relationship between Pokemon and their habitats. The Alola region also introduced the Z-move mechanic, which allowed Pokemon holding a corresponding Z crystal to perform a single powerful move once per battle. Z-moves were type-specific and could be used with any compatible move in the Pokemon's moveset, which created a different kind of decision-making than the held item economy of previous generations. The visual presentation of Z-moves, which involved a brief dance animation performed by both the player character and the Pokemon, was designed to reflect the Hawaiian cultural tradition of hula, and it gave the mechanic a sense of ceremony and physical embodiment that set it apart from any previous battle feature. The Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon games returned to the Alola region with an expanded story that introduced the Ultra Recon Squad, a group of travelers from an alternate dimension who communicated through a shared consciousness with Necrozma. The Ultra Wormhole system, which in the original Sun and Moon had been used primarily for the post-game Ultra Space encounter, was expanded in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon into a traversable space connecting multiple worlds. Players could fly through the wormholes in real time, with the density of cosmic objects in the environment indicating the strength of the legendary Pokemon that could be found at each destination. The Galar region, introduced in Pokemon Sword and Shield, was based on the United Kingdom, and the cultural references embedded in its design were more overtly specific than in any previous non-Japanese region. The gym system was reimagined as a stadium sport, with trainers competing in front of massive crowds in a format that directly echoed British football culture. The Champion Cup tournament at the end of the game functioned like a sporting championship, and the crowd dynamics and commentary added a layer of cultural specificity that made Galar feel like a place with a distinct social identity. The Dynamax mechanic introduced in Sword and Shield, which caused Pokemon to grow to enormous size during max raid battles and gym challenges, was designed around the concept of the kaiju, the giant monsters of Japanese science fiction and tokusatsu films. The Dynamax Pokemon's silhouettes against the cloudy skies of the Galar stadiums were clearly referencing the visual tradition of Godzilla and Ultraman, and the spectacle of oversized creatures battling within walled arenas was an explicit tribute to that tradition. The max raid battle format, which required 4 players to cooperate against a single Dynamax Pokemon, was the game's primary multiplayer content and introduced a cooperative model new to the mainline series. The wild area in Sword and Shield was the first open-world zone in a mainline Pokemon game, a large outdoor region where players could move the camera freely and encounter Pokémon at various levels roaming visibly on the overworld. The encounter table changed depending on the current weather, which cycled through different conditions over real-world days, and certain rare encounters were only available in specific weather conditions. This created a system of daily variation that encouraged players to check the wild area regularly and observe what had changed, connecting the game's content to the passage of real time in a way that felt more organic than the strict clock-based mechanics of earlier generations. Pokémon Legends Arceus, released in early 2022, represented the most radical redesign of the mainline Pokémon formula in the franchise's history. Set in a historical version of the Sinnoh region called Hisui, the game tasked players with creating the very first Pokedex, which meant encountering and studying Pokémon in the wild rather than just catching them in battles. The battle system itself was fundamentally altered with a new agile and strong style system, allowing players to modify the speed and power of each move, and Pokémon could be caught without battling at all by sneaking up on them and throwing Pokeballs directly. The game was also the first mainline title to consistently show Pokémon roaming freely in large environments without the random encounter model. The Hisui region in Legends Arceus contained Pokémon that had adapted to its specific environment in ways that resulted in new regional forms called Hisuian forms. These forms were designed to feel like they belonged to a world before the modern relationship between humans and Pokémon had been established, with wilder and more primal aesthetic qualities than their contemporary counterparts. Hisuian Braviary, for example, was a psychic and flying type, with a design evoking a spiritual guardian figure rather than the battle-ready bald eagle appearance of its modern form. The details of these designs consistently rewarded players who engaged with the lore of the Hisui region closely. The noble Pokémon encountered as bosses in Legends Arceus were described as Pokémon that had been imbued with a special power that made them frenzied and dangerous. The process of calming them required the player to throw bombs made from specific materials while dodging their attacks, an action-based system that had no precedent in the mainline series. The noble encounters were staged as set pieces with environmental design and narrative context that made each one feel like a meaningful event rather than a routine battle. The noble Electrode encounter in particular, which took place during a thunder ritual in a sacred space, was widely praised for its atmosphere. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, released in late 2022, delivered the franchise's first fully open-world mainline game, allowing players to approach the three main storylines in any order and at any point in their playthrough. The Paldea region, based on the Iberian Peninsula, primarily Portugal and Spain, was designed to allow total freedom of exploration from the moment the player left the starting town. High-level Pokémon roamed freely in areas far from the starting point, and encountering them early was possible even if defeating them was not, creating a sense of scale and open possibility that the franchise had never previously achieved. The Paradox Pokémon introduced in Scarlet and Violet represented one of the most conceptually ambitious additions to the franchise's creature design philosophy. Past forms of familiar Pokémon were presented as ancient creatures observed in historical records, with designs suggesting what those species might have looked like millions of years earlier. Future forms were presented as technological constructs, machine-like recreations of familiar shapes. The existence of these forms and the narrative surrounding them raised questions about the nature of time in the Pokémon world that the game deliberately left unresolved, creating a layer of uncertainty that drew players into extended speculation. The Terra-style mechanic introduced in Scarlet and Violet gave every Pokémon a hidden Terra type that, when activated, would replace its usual typing for the remainder of the battle. The visual presentation of terrestrialization surrounded the Pokémon in a crystalline structure that glittered like a gemstone, and the specific type of crystal varied based on the Pokémon's Terra type. The existence of Pokémon whose Terra type differed from their base type created a new dimension of competitive strategy, as a Pokémon could appear to be of one type, while actually being vulnerable to an entirely different set of attacks once the Terra type was revealed. The type chart, which determines the effectiveness of moves based on type matchups, has been modified and refined across generations in ways that reflect the game's evolving competitive landscape. The most significant single change was the introduction of the Fairy type in Generation 6, which was added primarily to address the dominance of Dragon-type Pokémon in competitive play. Dragon types had historically resisted most types while being weak only to Ice and other Dragon moves, creating a metagame in which Dragon-type Pokémon sat at the top of most team compositions. The Fairy type was designed as a direct counter, being immune to Dragon-type moves and super effective against Dragon types, and its introduction immediately shifted the competitive landscape. The introduction of the Steel type in Generation 2 served a similar balancing function for Psychic types. Steel was given immunities to Poison and to the new Dark type, which had been introduced partly to counter Psychic's dominance. The combination of these two new types in Generation 2 fundamentally restructured the type chart hierarchy that had defined competitive play in the original generation. Many Pokémon were given new dual typings in the Gold and Silver era that incorporated Steel or Dark, and the retroactive application of these types to previously released Pokémon created situations where players familiar with the original game discovered that creatures they thought they knew had changed in significant ways. The Dark type's introduction was accompanied by a thematic decision that shaped how it was perceived within the game's world. In Japanese, the type is called the Evil type rather than the Dark type, and the original framing of the type was explicitly about underhanded tactics and malicious behavior rather than simply about darkness or shadows. This distinction is reflected in the moves associated with the type, which include Bite, Crunch, Foul Play, and Sucker Punch, all of which suggest aggressive or opportunistic behavior rather than elemental darkness. The translation to Dark type in Western releases softened this ethical framing, but preserved the visual and behavioral associations. The Ghost type's complex relationship with normal and fighting types has been a mechanical constant throughout the franchise. Normal type moves do not affect Ghost types, and Ghost type moves do not affect normal types, a mutual immunity that reflects the folklore concept of physical and spiritual matter being unable to interact. Fighting type moves are also ineffective against Ghost types, which reflects the inability of purely physical force to affect something immaterial. This thematic coherence between type interactions and the concepts they represent is not unique to Ghost types, but it is nowhere more elegantly expressed, and it has never been changed despite many other modifications to the type chart over the years. The Electric type has the fewest weaknesses of any type in the franchise, with only a single weakness to Ground type moves. This narrow vulnerability is offset by the absence of immunities in the original games, but the introduction of specific abilities in later generations that allow Electric types to absorb electric moves and convert them to stat boosts further narrowed their counters. Volt Absorb and Motor Drive are among the most significant of these abilities, and their presence in the competitive metagame has made dealing with Electric types a genuine strategic consideration since Generation 3. The concept of abilities, passive powers that each Pokémon possesses and that activate under specific conditions, was introduced in Generation 3 and expanded substantially with each subsequent generation. The original ability pool was relatively small, but it introduced mechanics that permanently changed competitive strategy, including Intimidate, which lowers the opponent's attack on entry, and Levitate, which grants immunity to ground-type moves. The ability to choose between two potential abilities for most Pokémon was introduced in Generation 5, and later the concept of hidden abilities, rare alternate powers that could only be obtained through special events or specific encounter methods, added a further layer of depth to team building. The speed stat in Pokémon determines which Pokémon moves first in a given turn, and its role in competitive strategy is so significant that it has shaped the design of entire generations of creatures. A difference of even 1 point in speed can determine the outcome of a matchup between two otherwise evenly matched Pokémon. The mechanic of priority moves, which always move before standard moves regardless of speed, was introduced to provide counterplay to extremely fast Pokémon, and the evolution of priority mechanics from simple one-priority moves like Quick Attack to the complex priority systems of later generations reflects how central speed management became to competitive play. The move Minimize, which causes a Pokémon to reduce its size and double its evasiveness, has been at the center of several competitive controversies throughout the franchise's history. In its original form, the move stacked without limit, and using it repeatedly could make a Pokémon essentially untouchable by standard accuracy moves. The developers addressed this in Generation 3 by capping the evasiveness boost at 6 stages, but the move remained a source of frustration in casual play. Later generations added specific moves and abilities that ignored evasiveness boosts entirely, providing structural counterplay that did not require the developers to remove the move's function. The move Splash, which does nothing, is perhaps the most famous example of a move that exists seemingly as a joke within the game's systems. It can be learned only by a small number of Pokémon, with Magikarp being the most famous, and using it in battle produces a message stating that the move had no effect. The move's existence is often cited as a deliberate choice to reinforce the narrative arc of Magikarp, a creature so useless that even its moves do nothing, that eventually transforms into the fearsome Gyarados. The juxtaposition between Splash and Gyarados' powerful move pool is one of the franchise's most effective uses of evolutionary contrast as a storytelling device. Gyarados, despite being based on a dragon and being widely associated with the concept of dragon power in Japanese mythology, is not a dragon type. It is a water and flying type, an assignment that has confused players since the original games. The likely explanation offered by longtime community members is that the dragon type in Generation 1 was so powerful that the developers did not want to add it to a Pokémon as accessible as Gyarados, which could be obtained by evolving any Magikarp found on any body of water in the game. The type assignment has been retroactively justified through various Pokedex entries, but the original motivation appears to have been purely about game balance. The Eevee evolution line represents one of the franchise's most enduring design achievements. Eevee's ability to evolve into 8 different forms across the franchise's history, each corresponding to a different type, has made it a symbol of possibility and choice within the Pokémon world. The original 3 evolutions, Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon, were designed to cover the 3 most common elemental types in the original game. Espeon and Umbreon were added in Generation 2 with time-based evolution requirements that tied them to the game's day and night cycle. Leafeon and Glaceon required proximity to specific in-game objects in Diamond and Pearl before their requirements were simplified in later generations. The 8th Eevee evolution, the Sylveon, was introduced in Generation 6 alongside the fairy type itself, and it uses a ribbon-like feeler structure not present in any other evolution. Sylveon's evolution requirement, which originally involved maximizing an affection stat measured through the Pokemon Amy feature in X and WoW's, was changed in later games to involve friendship and knowledge of a fairy type move. The change in evolution method across game versions reflects the developer's ongoing adjustment of the affection and friendship systems, which were merged and redesigned in Generation 8. Sylveon has been consistently popular since its introduction, and speculation about a ninth evolution has been a recurring thread in community discussion for over a decade. The friendship mechanic, sometimes called happiness, has been present in the franchise since Generation 2 and determines not only the evolution of certain Pokémon, but also the power of some moves and the tendency of Pokémon to survive otherwise fatal attacks. The move Return, which was powered by friendship and dealt maximum damage when the Pokémon's friendship was at its cap, was one of the most reliable normal-type moves in the competitive metagame for many generations. Its complement, Frustration, which dealt maximum damage when friendship was at 0 and required players to deliberately keep their Pokémon unhappy, was a rarely used counterpart that reflected a darker conceptual space within the game's mechanics. The contest system, introduced in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, presented an entirely separate gameplay mode alongside the main battle system, allowing players to demonstrate their Pokémon's appeal in 5 different contest categories: coolness, beauty, cuteness, cleverness, and toughness. Winning contests at all 4 levels in all 5 categories completed a specific achievement, and some Pokémon had moves that were particularly effective in contest settings, but not in standard battle. The contest appeal values were entirely separate from battle mechanics, creating a parallel system that rewarded different kinds of engagement with the game. The contest system was later expanded in Diamond and Pearl into super contests before being removed from subsequent generations. The Pokémon musical introduced in Black and White as a replacement for the contest system was significantly simpler and was met with less enthusiasm from the community, as it offered fewer mechanical layers and less strategic depth. The removal of the full contest system from the mainline games has been one of the more consistent community requests in discussions about features players would like to see return, and the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes' inclusion of super contests was met with genuine enthusiasm. The longevity of the contest system's appeal reflects how effectively it served players who wanted a relationship with their Pokémon that was not defined solely by battle performance. The Pokémon anime has been broadcasting continuously since 1997, making it one of the longest-running animated series in history. Ash Ketchum, the primary protagonist for the vast majority of that run, was designed to be a character whose age would remain perpetually undefined, allowing the series to continue indefinitely without aging out its narrative premise. The anime's relationship to the games has always been complex, with certain elements, such as Ash's Pikachu refusing to evolve, being presented as character decisions within the story rather than mechanical impossibilities, even though they reflect a creative choice to keep the series' visual identity stable. Ash's Pikachu was confirmed in an early episode to have declined the Thunderstone that would evolve it into Raichu, a decision that the episode frames as a statement about Pikachu's identity and its desire to grow stronger on its own terms rather than through the shortcuts of forced evolution. This narrative choice simultaneously addressed the question players would inevitably ask about why the main character's Pokémon never evolved, and established a thematic foundation for the series' treatment of evolution as a choice rather than an inevitability. The episode has been revisited implicitly in later arcs whenever Ash's other Pokémon choose to evolve or choose not to. The anime's treatment of legendary Pokémon has generally positioned them as forces of nature that transcend the normal relationship between trainers and Pokémon, appearing in the story as events rather than as characters in the conventional sense. The exceptions to this rule, such as Ash's Latias-adjacent experience in the 5th movie, or the recurring appearances of specific legendary Pokémon as protectors of particular locations, have produced some of the anime's most emotionally resonant material, The Pokemon movies have consistently expanded the franchise's mythology in directions the games do not follow, creating a parallel body of lore that occupies an uncertain canonical status. The Pokemon Adventures manga, published in Japan as Pocket Monsters Special, presents a version of the Pokemon world that is notably darker and more willing to engage with the implications of the setting's premise than either the games or the anime. Characters die or come close to death in the manga. Pokemon are used in ways that suggest genuine danger, and the relationships between trainers and their Pokemon are explored with more psychological depth than in other media. The manga's interpretations of certain characters, particularly the early generation's gym leaders and rivals, have been embraced by portions of the community as the definitive characterizations of those figures. The trading card game, which launched in North America in 1998, rapidly became a cultural phenomenon that may have exceeded the games in public visibility during the peak of the late 1990s Pokemon craze. Schools across the United States banned the cards as a distraction, and news reports of playground disputes over rare cards became a recurring feature of media coverage of the franchise. The holographic Charizard from the base set became one of the most economically significant trading cards ever produced, with high-grade copies selling for extraordinary sums in the collector market that developed decades later. The card's value was partly genuine economic scarcity and partly the weight of an entire generation's shared memory. The competitive trading card game has evolved into a sophisticated strategic game with its own dedicated professional circuit, including world championships held annually with substantial prize pools. The design team behind the card game works separately from the video game team, but coordinates on theming and the introduction of new mechanics. Major video game competitive mechanics, such as Mega Evolution, Zub Moves, and Dynamax, were implemented in the card game with appropriate timing to align with their video game releases, creating a unified marketing moment across both games simultaneously. Pokémon Go, released in 2016, brought the franchise's core concept of exploring the real world to find Pokémon to its most literal realization. The game used GPS and augmented reality technology to place Pokémon in the real-world locations around the player, and the map was generated from a database of real-world points of interest. The game's launch created a brief period of genuine cultural phenomenon, with groups of players gathering in parks and public spaces to hunt rare Pokémon together. The social dimension of Pokémon Go, which turned the act of playing into a reason to be in specific public locations simultaneously with other players, was entirely new to the franchise. Pokémon Go's influence on the physical world extended in directions that were difficult to predict. Businesses located near popular Pokestops and gyms reported increased foot traffic. Real-world landmarks became associated with specific Pokémon or game events in the minds of players. The game created a new relationship between digital content and physical space, and its community features, including the annual Pokémon Go Fest events held in specific cities around the world, drew tens of thousands of players to specific locations for coordinated real-world Pokémon hunting experiences. The game remains one of the most played mobile games globally years after its initial launch. The Pokémon Company International's approach to competitive play has formalized over the decades into the Pokémon Video Game Championships, a globally structured tournament circuit that culminates in an annual World Championship event. The format of VGC, which uses doubles battles and a rotating series rule set, requires players to build teams specifically for the current season's format, rather than maintaining a stable team across years. This creates a constantly evolving competitive environment where established strategies become outdated regularly, and the community of theory crafters who analyze each new format and develop the first successful team concepts are highly regarded within competitive circles. The speed tier in competitive Pokemon is a deeply studied area of the community's technical knowledge. Players maintain detailed charts of every Pokemon's base speed and the thresholds at which common speed-boosting items and abilities allow one Pokemon to outspeed another. The decision of whether to run a particular speed investment on a Pokemon, and if so, how much, involves consulting these charts and making predictions about which threats the team is most likely to encounter. This kind of technical depth is accessible to casual players only through the community's documentation efforts, and the work of maintaining and distributing that knowledge represents a significant ongoing contribution by the competitive community to the broader player base. The online battle simulator Pokémon Showdown, which allows players to create teams and battle others without needing to play through any mainline game, has become one of the most important tools for competitive players and for the spread of competitive knowledge to new players. Showdown's accessibility removed the barrier of needing to breed and raise specific Pokémon in the actual games in order to experiment with competitive strategies, and its tier system, maintained by the Smogon University community, provided a structure for understanding which Pokémon were appropriate for which levels of play. The relationship between Game Freak's official competitive formats and the Smogon community's independently maintained tiers has been complex, with significant divergences in which Pokémon are considered appropriate for use. The Smogon University website, which grew from a competitive battling community forum into one of the most comprehensive Pokémon competitive resources available, developed the tier system that categorizes every Pokémon based on their usage rate and competitive viability. Overused, underused, rarely used, and never used are the primary tiers, with additional specialized tiers for mechanics like Ubers, where the most powerful Pokémon are placed, and Little Cup, where only base stage Pokémon are allowed. This system has shaped how an entire generation of competitive players understand the game's relative power levels, and certain Smogon-produced analyses of specific Pokémon are cited so often that they have become de facto canonical descriptions of how those creatures should be used. The concept of natures, introduced in Generation 3, added a personality system that modified 2 of a Pokemon's stats by 10%, boosting one by 10% and reducing another by the same amount. The 25 available natures, including 5 neutral natures that provided no modification, created a system that made each individual Pokemon slightly but meaningfully distinct from others of the same species. The optimal nature for competitive play became part of the standard language of team building, with phrases like timid for special attackers or adamant for physical attackers becoming shorthand for the most commonly recommended configurations. The mint items introduced in later generations allowed players to change the effect of a Pokemon's nature on its stats, though the nature displayed remained unchanged. This retroactive solution to the challenge of obtaining Pokemon with specific natures represented a significant quality of life improvement for competitive players who had previously needed to breed multiple generations of Pokemon to obtain the correct nature for their team. The introduction of mints, along with bottle caps that allowed players to maximize individual values, reflected the developers' ongoing effort to make the competitive preparation process less onerous without removing the systems that competitive players found meaningful. The breeding minigame in Pokémon Sword and Shield was redesigned to allow players to hatch multiple eggs simultaneously by cycling through different sections of the wild area, and the time required to hatch eggs was further reduced by the presence of certain abilities and items that had been in the game since Generation 3. The Flame Body ability, possessed by certain Fire-type Pokémon, halved the number of steps required to hatch an egg when the ability user was in the party. This mechanic had been present for years, but its interaction with the egg cycling mechanics of later games created increasingly efficient breeding workflows that were documented and refined by the competitive community. The Pokemon franchise's spin-off games have explored the setting and characters from perspectives that the mainline games do not. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, in which the player becomes a Pokemon rather than a trainer, presents the franchise's world from an internal perspective that raises different questions about its nature. The Mystery Dungeon games have consistently been praised for their emotional storytelling, with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky in particular being cited as among the most narratively affecting games in the franchise's history. The central story of Explorers of Sky, which involves time travel, predestination, and sacrifice, reached emotional conclusions that surprised players who expected a lighter experience. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series handles the concept of Pokemon mortality more directly than any other Pokemon media. Dungeons contain descriptions of Pokemon who died there, and the stakes of the story involve the permanent loss of things that cannot be recovered. The final stretch of Explorers of Sky involves the player being told that fulfilling their destiny will result in their own erasure from existence, and the choice to proceed anyway is presented as genuinely sacrificial. The resolution of that storyline and the emotional impact it has had on players who encountered it during childhood has been documented extensively by the community and represents a significant part of that game's lasting legacy. The sound design of the Pokemon games has been a consistent strength throughout the franchise's history, with the music of composers Junichi Masuda and later Hitomi Sato becoming deeply associated with specific memories for an entire generation. The battle music of the original games was composed to loop seamlessly without becoming tedious during long encounters, and the layering of instruments was designed to build tension as battles progressed. The Pokémon Gold and Silver soundtracks, composed for the Game Boy Color's expanded audio capabilities, included themes like the gym battle music and the Elite Four theme that remain among the most recognized pieces of video game music ever composed for handheld hardware. The legendary Pokemon encounter themes have been among the most carefully composed pieces in each generation's soundtrack, designed to convey grandeur and significance in the limited audio format available. The Kyogre and Groudon theme in Ruby and Sapphire used layered synthesized strings and percussion to create a sense of elemental scale. The Dialga and Palkia theme in Diamond and Pearl incorporated a choir element that gave it a ceremonial quality. The Ends theme in Black and White, which played during the final confrontation, was designed to feel like a melody that had been accompanying the player throughout the game without them realizing it, with elements that recalled earlier tracks now revealed as fragments of the same larger composition. The sound of the Pokeball shaking during a capture attempt has been analyzed extensively by the community for what it does and does not indicate about the likelihood of a successful catch. The number of shakes before either the Pokemon breaks free or the ball locks shut is determined by the game's internal random number generation at the moment the ball makes contact, and subsequent shakes are informational rather than mechanically significant. This means that a Pokeball shaking 3 times and then opening is not mechanically different from one that shakes once and opens, but the experience of watching 3 shakes and feeling the capture slip away is emotionally distinct in a way that has made the 3-shake release one of the most discussed experiences in the community. The critical capture mechanic, which causes the Pokeball to shake only once before either locking shut or opening, depending on a separate probability calculation triggered before the standard capture formula, was introduced in Generation 5. When a critical capture occurs, the ball bounces off the thrown arc and lands with a single definitive shake, bypassing the 3-shake sequence entirely. The visual and audio presentation of the critical capture, which uses distinct sound effects and a screen flash, creates an unmistakable signal that something different has happened. Experienced players recognize it immediately, and the moment of recognition produces a specific kind of excited attention that the standard capture sequence has been designed to build toward. The RNG, or Random Number Generation System, underlying the Pokémon games, has been studied by a dedicated community of players who use its properties to predict and manipulate the outcomes of random events. This practice, known as RNG manipulation, requires players to understand the internal state of the game's random number generator at a specific point and to perform actions that advance its state by precisely the right number of steps to produce a desired outcome. The technique has been used to obtain legendary Pokémon with perfect individual values, to encounter shiny Pokémon at will, and to hatch eggs with predetermined characteristics. The community that practices this skill has developed software tools and detailed documentation that make the process accessible to players with the patience to learn it. The concept of soft resetting, in which the player holds specific button combinations to restart the game from a saved state rather than from the beginning, became a standard technique for players hunting legendary Pokémon with specific characteristics. Soft resetting a legendary encounter takes a few seconds and allows the player to repeatedly attempt the encounter until it produces a shiny coloration or favorable individual values. The amount of time required to find a desired result through soft resetting can range from a few minutes to many hundreds of hours, and the Pokémon hunting community has developed a rich culture around sharing soft resetting experiences, celebrating long hunts that finally yield their goal, and supporting members who have been hunting a specific Pokémon for extended periods. The longest documented shiny hunt on record in the community involved a player searching for a specific legendary Pokémon in a specific game over a period of multiple years, with the encounter count eventually exceeding tens of thousands of attempts before the desired shiny coloration appeared. Stories of this kind circulate in the community as a form of collective endurance narrative, a testament to the specific kind of commitment that the franchise inspires. The moment of finding what has been searched for across such extraordinary persistence is described by those who experience it in terms that go well beyond simple satisfaction, a relief and joy that registers in a physical way. The full odds shiny hunting community, which restricts itself to hunting shinies only through methods that do not increase the base probability, has developed its own culture and terminology entirely separate from the manipulated hunting community. Full odds hunters calculate their expected hunt length using probability theory and track their encounter counts using community software. The psychological experience of hunting at full odds is distinct from other kinds of hunting because the expected value of each individual encounter is exactly the same regardless of how many encounters have already occurred. A shiny may appear on the first encounter or the 100,000th, and each attempt carries the same weight. The Masuda method, by increasing the probability of a shiny egg to roughly 1 in 512 in its standard form, made breeding-based shiny hunting accessible to players who did not want to engage with RNG manipulation. The method's requirement for Pokémon from games with different language settings created a social incentive for international trading, and the GTS trading system, designed by Masuda himself, was partly intended to facilitate the international connections that his own method rewarded. The symmetry between Masuda designing the global trading system and Masuda designing the mechanic that rewarded using it reflects the way the franchise's social features were deliberately engineered to create connections between players. The Shiny Charm, an item introduced in Generation 5 that further reduces the odds of encountering a shiny Pokémon to roughly 1 in 1,366 for wild encounters, requires the player to complete the Pokedex before it can be obtained. This design decision creates a direct incentive for Pokedex completion that goes beyond the diploma reward, offering a tangible gameplay benefit for the most dedicated completionists. The combination of the shiny charm and the Masuda method reduces odds to approximately 1 in 512, making shiny breeding a practical goal for dedicated players willing to invest significant time. The Pokémon World Championships, held annually, bring together the top competitive players from every region for a multi-day event that covers multiple formats across both video games and the trading card game. The quality of play at the highest levels of competitive Pokémon is such that small mechanical decisions made fractions of a second before a turn's input window closes can determine the winner of a top 8 match. The community's documentation of championship matches through recorded video, detailed analysis of team compositions, and discussion of the specific decisions made in key turns has created an extensive archive of high-level play that is studied by competitive players seeking to improve. The Pokémon documentary movement, in which content creators produce long-form explorations of specific aspects of the franchise's history, design, and culture, has produced some of the most detailed examinations of any gaming franchise available in video form. Topics ranging from the design history of specific Pokémon, the evolution of competitive formats, the cultural impact of specific games, and the technical analysis of the game's code and systems have been explored in productions that range from a few minutes to several hours in length. This body of community-created documentation represents a significant cultural artifact in its own right. The speedrunning community has mapped the Pokémon games more thoroughly than perhaps any other body of players, exploiting every known glitch and mechanical shortcut to reduce the time required to complete the main story to extraordinary minimums. The any percent category for the original Pokémon Red and Blue has been pushed below 2 minutes through the use of the glitch that allows the player to jump directly to the end credits through a specific sequence of memory manipulation. The discovery and refinement of this technique required a deep understanding of the game's memory architecture that goes far beyond anything the original developers anticipated. The Pokémon Glitch exhibition community has cataloged and documented glitches across every generation of the franchise with extraordinary thoroughness. The Glitch City in Generation 1, a corrupted area that can be accessed by exploiting a specific sequence in the Safari Zone, produces visual artifacts and unusual behavior that players in the original era found genuinely frightening before understanding that it was the result of the game rendering map data incorrectly. The cloning glitch in Gold and Silver, which allowed players to duplicate any Pokémon by exploiting a specific behavior in the daycare PC interaction, was used so widely that it became an accepted part of the casual game culture of that era. The missing number glitch in the original Pokémon Red and Blue is one of the most famous glitches in all of video game history. Encountered by using the Old Man Fishing tutorial in Viridian City and then surfing along a specific coastline near Cinnabar Island, missing number appears as a corrupted Pokémon sprite whose designation, the number 000 in the internal Pokémon data, corresponds to no designed creature. The encounter does no permanent damage to the game, but is famous for causing the player's item bag to overflow, duplicating whatever item is in the 6th slot. This unintended consequence of missing numberature's presence was exploited by players to duplicate rare items, most famously rare candies and Master Balls. The Master Ball, the item that guarantees capture of any Pokémon, regardless of its HP, is given to the player once in each mainline game, almost always as a reward for a significant story milestone. The rarity of the Master Ball creates a persistent question for players about how to use it, and the community has developed a rich tradition of advice and debate about the optimal target. Dedicated players who intend to catch legendary Pokémon at perfect individual values through soft resetting deliberately avoid using the Master Ball, since catching a Pokemon in a standard Pokeball and having it produce perfect values is considered a more satisfying achievement. Keeping the Master Ball unused throughout a playthrough has become a cultural practice for many dedicated players. The Pokeball variety has expanded enormously since the original game's single design. Generation 2 introduced specialized balls, including the Moon Ball, Love Ball, Friend Ball, and Fast Ball, each with enhanced catch rates under specific conditions. Generation 3 added balls like the Net Ball for water and bug types, and the Dive Ball for underwater encounters. Generation 4 introduced the Dusk Ball, which has an enhanced catch rate at night or in caves, the Timer Ball, which becomes more effective the more turns a battle has lasted, and the Quick Ball, which is strongest when thrown on the first turn of a battle. The variety of ball options transformed item selection before legendary encounters into a strategic consideration, with players choosing their ball selection based on the location and conditions of the specific encounter. The aesthetic dimension of Pokeball choice has become significant in a community that values the visual presentation of their trained Pokemon. A competitive Pokemon kept in a specific type of ball carries that ball's design, even in battle animations that show the ball opening and closing, and certain ball designs are considered particularly elegant alongside specific Pokemon. The practice of breeding Pokemon specifically to pass down a particular ball type through the female parent's ball inheritance, a mechanic introduced in later generations, created a secondary layer of customization in team preparation that goes beyond stats and moves into pure aesthetic expression. The way Pokemon are stored in the games has evolved significantly from the original PC box system, which required players to access specific terminals to deposit or retrieve Pokemon from storage. The original system's limitation of storing only 180 Pokemon in total created genuine inventory management challenges for collectors attempting to build complete Pokedexes. Each subsequent generation expanded the available storage until the Pokemon Home Cloud service made it possible to store thousands of Pokemon accessible across multiple devices, and the question of storage became effectively unlimited. The philosophical shift this represented from Pokemon as scarce commodities, requiring careful management, to Pokemon as an abundant digital collection, is one of the franchise's larger structural changes. The Pokemon storage system's Bill character, whose name is a direct reference to Bill Gates, and whose backstory involves accidentally fusing himself with a Pokemon in a teleportation experiment, is one of the original game's most curious minor characters. His technical genius is presented as the reason why the PC storage system exists at all, and his appearance as a normal human during the player's visit to his house following the correction of his teleportation accident is a brief moment of body horror played entirely straight within an otherwise cheerful game. Bill reappears in Gold and Silver with an expanded role as the architect of the Pokemon storage system improvements, and his characterization there is consistent with the original subtle oddness. The Pokemon Day care couple in the original games appears to have a relationship that the games never comment on directly. The text of their interactions, particularly in Gold and Silver, suggests a long partnership between two people who work closely with Pokemon every day and whose expertise in their field is treated with genuine respect by the surrounding community. The daycare man's delivery of Pokemon eggs, with a characteristic speech about finding something he cannot explain, reflects a touch of whimsy and wonder that the games insert into otherwise mechanical systems, giving the sense that the world contains more texture than any single playthrough will fully reveal. The friendship between Professor Oak and the player's father figure, Professor Elm, and the various regional professors who appear in each game reflects a pattern of benevolent mentorship that runs through the franchise's narrative structure. The professor's role of giving the player their first Pokemon is a ceremony repeated in every mainline game with enough variation to feel fresh while maintaining the ritual quality of the moment. The player's relationship with their starter Pokémon begins at this point and is designed to be the emotional anchor of the entire experience, the creature that was there from the beginning and that will ideally carry the player through to the end. The post-game content of the Pokémon games has historically been where the franchise's most dedicated content has been placed, with rematch options against gym leaders, access to additional legendary Pokémon, and the opportunity to explore areas that were not available during the main story. The Pokémon World Tournament in Black 2 and White 2 allowed players to battle against gym leaders and champions from every previous generation, the most comprehensive retrospective gathering of past characters in any mainline game. The inclusion of characters from the very first games, standing alongside characters from the most recent generation, created a sense of the franchise's full historical depth in a single location. The rival character in each Pokémon game has evolved from the openly antagonistic Blue in Generation 1 to increasingly nuanced figures whose motivations and growth arcs have become more central to the story. Blue, whose name in the original games reflects his cold and competitive nature, is defeated at the Pokémon League, only to be revealed as the champion the player must face after defeating the Elite Four, a narrative structure that transforms the recurring antagonism of the rival relationship into a final confrontation with someone who has been growing alongside the player throughout the entire journey. The emotional resonance of that encounter depends on the entire history of the relationship that preceded it. Silver and Gold and Silver is the franchise's most morally complex rival, a character who steals his starter Pokémon from the beginning, and whose hostility toward trainers who show what he considers weakness is rooted in a backstory involving his father's criminal leadership of Team Rocket. The game reveals his father's identity through a brief but significant exchange in a late-game location, and the implication of Silver's arc is that he is in the process of choosing a different identity than the one his father represents. His eventual character growth is implied rather than stated directly, and the restraint of the storytelling gives it more weight than an explicit redemption narrative would. The villainous teams of the Pokémon games have grown more ideologically complex over the generations, from Team Rocket's straightforward criminal enterprise to Team Plasma's genuine philosophical challenge about the ethics of keeping Pokémon, to the varied motivations of teams in subsequent generations. Team Rocket's relationship with Giovanni, who is simultaneously the final gym leader in Kanto and the organization's leader, creates a narrative structure in which the final obstacle before the Pokémon League is inseparable from the game's primary antagonist. The moment of discovering Giovanni's dual role, if the player does not already know, is one of the original game's most effectively placed plot revelations. The Giovanni connection extends across generations through the Team Rocket chapters of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, in which the organization's attempt to regroup without their leader is presented as a story about loyalty and self-deception among people who have built their identities around following someone who has abandoned them. Giovanni's absence from this storyline is more dramatically effective than his presence would have been, and the game's handling of the Team Rocket members as a group navigating their leader's disappearance gives them a complexity unusual for franchise antagonists at that time. The antagonist Getsus in Pokémon Black and White presents a different kind of darkness than any previous franchise villain. His stated ideology about separating Pokémon from humans is revealed to be entirely cynical, a manipulation designed to ensure that he alone possesses Pokémon in a world where everyone else has released theirs. His personal relationship with his adopted son, N, whose genuine belief in the ideology Getsus manufactured is used as a tool and then abandoned when no longer useful, makes Getsus one of the franchise's most genuinely disturbing figures. The moment of his unmasking and the directness of his hostility toward N in front of the player is unlike anything in the franchise's prior history. The protagonist's silence in the mainline Pokemon games is a deliberate design choice that allows players to project their own identity onto the character while still experiencing a story that is coherent and emotionally consistent. The silent protagonist convention means that the player's character never expresses doubt, fear, or uncertainty, but it also means that every emotional response in the narrative is filtered through the reactions of other characters. This creates a specific narrative position in which the player witnesses the emotional responses of every character around them while remaining personally unaffected, a position that becomes strange in games like Black and White, where the story engages with genuinely emotional material. The Elite Four structure, which requires the player to defeat 4 increasingly powerful trainers in sequence before facing the champion, has been a constant of the mainline games since the original. The requirement to defeat all 4 without leaving creates a specific kind of pressure during the player's first encounter with them, and the lack of a second wind after a difficult battle adds weight to the preparation required before entering. The Elite Four have been characterized with varying degrees of distinctiveness across generations, but the most memorable ensembles are those in which each member's design, type specialty, and dialogue collectively paint a portrait of a world in which strength has been developed through genuine dedication to a specific perspective. The champion battles of each generation are designed to function as the emotional climax of the main story, a final test of the relationship between the player and their team that has been built across the entire game. The most celebrated champion battles are those in which the champion's team feels genuinely formidable and in which the champion's character has been established strongly enough that the confrontation carries personal weight. Cynthia in Sinnoh, whose team includes a Garchomp with an almost perfectly distributed moveset that covers every common weakness, is considered by competitive players and casual players alike to represent one of the most thoughtfully constructed champion teams in the franchise's history. The specific moves and items that Cynthia's Garchomp carries in Diamond and Pearl have been memorized and discussed by the community to an extent that makes them cultural knowledge in competitive circles. The combination of Earthquake, Dragon Claw, Fire Blast, and Swords Dance on a Pokémon with base 102 speed and base 130 attack made Garchomp one of the most commonly banned Pokémon in Generation 4 competitive formats. The fact that the final boss of the most complete Diamond and Pearl game uses this Pokémon as her centerpiece is a design choice that respects the player's understanding of power while using that power as the game's most demanding obstacle. The Pokémon designs themselves are often described through the lens of their inspiration material, but the most effectively designed creatures are those in which the inspiration has been transformed enough that it functions as a foundation rather than a reference. Sableye, a ghost and dark-type Pokémon with gem-like eyes and a love of precious stones, draws from the tradition of cave-dwelling folklore creatures, but combines it with gemological visual language in a way that creates something that feels genuinely new. Its typing, which left it with no weaknesses in Generation 3 before fairy types were introduced, was a point of competitive discussion for years, and the creature's combination of mechanical distinctiveness and design elegance made it one of the more memorable designs of its generation. The design of Spiritomb represents one of the franchise's more direct engagements with horror aesthetics. A Pokémon formed from 108 trapped spirits, Spiritomb was available in Diamond and Pearl only through a social mechanic that required the player to speak with 100 different people in the underground area, a feature that required either a large gathering of players with the game or extensive manipulation of the game's local wireless systems. The effort required to obtain it was designed to reflect the weight of what it contained, a creature born of darkness that required genuine effort to bring into the world. Its typing left it with no weaknesses before the fairy type existed, a distinction it shared with Sableye. The Pokemon Spiritome's Pokedex entries describe it as having been bound inside a hollow stone known as an odd keystone as punishment for misdeeds committed in life. The number 108 is significant in Buddhist tradition as the number of earthly temptations or desires that must be overcome, and the creature's design reflects this cultural reference through its positioning within a specific spiritual framework. This kind of embedded cultural reference, placed quietly in a creature's lore without being highlighted, is characteristic of the franchise's approach to the deeper layers of its world building, rewarding players who bring specific cultural knowledge to their reading of the Pokedex. The Pokedex entries for Yamask describe a creature that was once a human being, carrying a golden mask that bears the face it wore in its previous life. The entry specifically states that Yamask sometimes stops to look at the mask and cries. This degree of explicit sadness and loss in a Pokemon's lore is unusual even for ghost types, which generally lean toward uncanny or mischievous characterizations, and the entry has become one of the most frequently cited examples of the franchise quietly delivering genuinely melancholic content within a format aimed at children. Players who read it as children and revisit it as adults often find it landing differently. The Pokemon Gorgeist, introduced in Generation 6, has Pokedex entries describing it as wrapping its arms around victims on nights with a new moon and singing them into a cursed sleep. The entry appears to be describing an entity that murders people, and it does so in language that is simultaneously beautiful and disturbing. This is not an isolated example. Multiple Pokemon in later generations have entries that describe predatory or violent behavior in terms that would seem extraordinary in any other context. The franchise's willingness to allow this darkness to coexist with its broader cheerfulness reflects an understanding of what makes the Pokemon world feel genuinely inhabited. The Phantompe Pokedex entry describes it as a stump possessed by the spirit of a child who died in a forest and became lost. This entry is presented without further context or emotional commentary in most games. The brevity of the description makes it more affecting than an extended narrative would, a single sentence that opens a world of implication and then closes without resolution. It is the kind of thing that a child playing the game might read and pass over, and that an adult replaying the game years later might stop at and hold. The entries for Drifloon state that the creature grabs the hands of small children and carries them away, and that children who are grabbed by it and try to run away simply vanish. The entry then notes that Drifloon has a habit of making a popping sound when disappointed. This combination of child abduction horror and comic deflation is a specific tonal register that appears throughout the Ghost-type Pokedex entries and reflects the franchise's complex relationship with darkness, horror, and humor. The entries read as if they are aware of their own strangeness, playing with the reader's expectations about what kind of content belongs in a children's game. The concept of Pokemon evolution is one of the franchise's most fundamental premises, but the word evolution, as used in the games, does not match the biological meaning of the term. Biological evolution refers to population-level changes over generations, while Pokemon evolution describes a metamorphosis of the individual, more comparable to the process of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly than to the genetic diversification of a species across time. The distinction is never addressed in the games, and most players absorb the franchise's use of the term without applying the biological definition to it. The few games that do touch on evolutionary theory in the biological sense, typically through specific Pokemon like Shedinja or Nincada, do so in ways that complicate rather than resolve the conceptual overlap. The evolution of Shedinja is one of the franchise's most mechanically and narratively curious events. When a Nincada evolves into Ninjask, a second Pokemon, Shedinja, appears in an empty slot in the player's party. The explanation given is that Shedinja is the shed shell of the Ninkata's transformation, inhabited by a spirit that entered through the crack in its back. Shedinja has a mechanic called Wonder Guard that makes it immune to every move except super effective ones, a powerful ability made possible by the creature's HP being permanently fixed at 1. This combination of unusual origin, creepy lore, and mechanically extreme characteristics makes Shedinja one of the franchise's most discussed design achievements. The Pokemon Ditto is one of the most mechanically interesting creatures in the franchise, capable of transforming into any Pokemon it faces using the move Transform. Ditto's ability to copy any other Pokemon's stats, moveset, and appearance made it a useful utility Pokemon in the original generation, and its role in the breeding system as the universal partner for any species changed its mechanical significance fundamentally. Any Pokemon can breed with Ditto, regardless of its own breeding compatibility with other species, making Ditto an essential tool for competitive team preparation and a creature whose value in the game's systems far exceeds its competitive battle performance. The Pokemon cast form, introduced in Generation 3, was designed to change its appearance and typing based on the current weather condition, existing as a normal type in ordinary conditions and shifting to fire, water, or ice types in sunny day, rain dance, and hail weather, respectively. The design was specifically created to express the concept of a creature whose identity is shaped by its environment, and it was placed within the Weather Institute, the location in Hoenn where the Weather Trio's conflict most directly affects the region's climate. Cast form's typing changes during weather do not persist outside of battle, which limits its practical utility, but preserves the idea that it is a creature of temporary states. The Pokemon Unknown, which are shaped like letters of the alphabet and have been present since Generation 2, hold a special position in the franchise's lore despite being mechanically one of the least useful species available. They are associated with mysterious ruins in every game that contains them, and their collective power is described in legendary terms, capable of reshaping reality in sufficient numbers. The Pokemon movie The Power of One presents a version of their power that is literally reality-bending, and the Ruins of Alph puzzle in gold and silver hints at a translation of ancient language using unknown characters. The gap between their narrative importance and their mechanical weakness creates a tension that makes them feel genuinely mysterious. The Pokemon Slowpoke has occupied a special cultural position within the franchise community that goes beyond its in-game characteristics. Its reputation for extreme slowness, both in terms of its in-game speed stat and its lore, in which it sometimes does not realize its tail has been bitten for an entire day, made it a symbol of peaceful unawareness that resonated with an unusually wide audience. Slowpoke has been used in Japanese internet culture as a symbol of being late to news or trends, and the Pokemon Company has leaned into the character's cultural significance in various promotional campaigns that treat it as a figure of gentle comedy. The Pokemon Smeargle, which can learn almost any move in the game through its signature move sketch, has been a fixture of competitive team building since its introduction in Generation 2. Sketch permanently copies the last move the target used, allowing Smeargle to build a moveset of virtually any 4 moves in the game's catalog. This unlimited potential has made Smeargle one of the most discussed Pokemon in competitive theory, and certain Smeargle sets, using combinations of otherwise incompatible moves, created formats unto themselves. The creature's painter-themed design, complete with a tail that functions as a paintbrush, is one of the franchise's more elegant, conceptual integrations of design and mechanic. The franchise's most complex competitive interaction, commonly discussed in terms of the effects of specific move combinations, may be the interaction between the move bat and pass and the stat-boosting mechanic. Baton Pass transfers any stat changes accumulated by the user to the Pokemon that replaces it, creating the possibility of passing accumulated boosts to a Pokemon capable of sweeping through an entire team. The Baton Pass strategy was so powerful that it required specific restrictions in almost every competitive format, and various generations addressed it differently, with some banning the move combination and others limiting the number of Pokemon on a team that could use Baton Pass. The weather mechanics introduced more fully in Generation 3 created a system of passive damage and type-based stat modifications that fundamentally changed how teams were built for competitive play. Sandstorm, Rain Dance, Sunny Day, and Hail each modified the effectiveness of different move types and introduced passive damage at the end of each turn for Pokemon who were not immune to the weather condition. Team compositions, built around exploiting specific weather, became known as weather teams, and the prevalence of weather-based strategies in Generation 5's competitive environment, where 3 powerful legendary Pokemon could each automatically summon different weather upon entering battle, led to one of the most discussed competitive metas in the franchise's history. The terrains introduced in Generation 6, including electric terrain, grassy terrain, misty terrain, and psychic terrain, added a further layer of battlefield modification that interacted with weather in complex ways. Terrains affected only grounded Pokemon, those not airborne or floating above the ground, which created a new mechanic for distinguishing which Pokemon were affected by which battlefield conditions. The interaction between terrain effects and various abilities and moves created a rich space for team-building creativity, and the terrain-setting moves and abilities became key components of high-level competitive team compositions. The concept of the metagame, the ecosystem of strategies, counters, and adaptations that develops in competitive play above the level of individual match decisions, is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Pokemon competitive community. The metagame shifts constantly in response to new information, new games, and the tournament results that reveal which strategies are dominant at the highest levels. A strategy that is novel and effective in 1 month may be thoroughly countered by the following month as the community adapts. The cycle of strategy development, spread, countering, and adaptation creates a kind of evolutionary pressure that keeps the competitive game genuinely dynamic. The difference between the formats used in official Pokemon tournaments and the formats maintained by the Smogon community represents one of the most persistent points of divergence in the competitive Pokemon world. Official VGC tournaments use doubles format with a restricted set of items and specific clauses about certain moves. Smogon's primary singles format uses a different set of rules developed independently, and the two communities have developed distinct strategies and vocabularies around their respective formats. Players who excel in one format do not automatically excel in the other, and the skills developed in each context transfer only partially. The Pokemon franchise's relationship with competitive balance has been complicated by the existence of legendary and mythical Pokemon whose base stats significantly exceed those of non-legendary species. The official competitive formats address this through a system of usage restrictions that separate legendary and non-legendary formats, and through series-specific rules that ban or restrict specific powerful Pokemon. The community debates about which restrictions are appropriate and which create unfair advantages have been ongoing throughout the franchise's competitive history and reflect genuine differences of opinion about the purpose of competitive restrictions. The Pokémon Arceus game, released for Nintendo Switch in 2022, presented a new origin story for the starters of the Sinnoh generation, revealing that Chimchar, Turtwig, and Piplup existed in a historical form in the Hisui region as well. The game also revealed the origin of the Pokedex as an artifact created by a specific individual in a specific historical context, grounding the device in a narrative origin that the games had previously left undefined. These additions to the Sinnoh mythology retroactively enriched the original Diamond and Pearl games for players who revisited them after experiencing Legends Arceus. The Pokémon Scarlet and Violet DLC expansions, titled the Teal Mask and the Indigo Disc, expanded the Paldea region with new areas based on different parts of Japan and introduced a new legendary Pokémon alongside new Paradox forms and new characters whose stories continued beyond the main game's resolution. The DLC format for Pokémon, which began with Sun and Moon's expansion pass and continued through subsequent games, represented a shift in the franchise's content delivery model and raised discussions about the completeness of the base game versus the enhanced experience available with additional purchase. The Pokémon franchise's first quarter century produced a volume of creative output that is genuinely difficult to encompass in any single treatment. More than 900 individual species, dozens of games across many hardware platforms, anime episodes numbering in the thousands, manga volumes, trading cards in the hundreds of millions, and a global culture of play and community engagement that spans every continent. The scale of what has been built on the foundation of one man's childhood memory of catching insects near a suburban Tokyo neighborhood is one of the more extraordinary stories in the history of commercial entertainment. And the creatures at the center of it, each one carrying the weight of someone's care and someone's intention, remain inexhaustibly interesting. The specific details embedded in Pokémon designs reward the kind of attention that comes naturally when you are not trying to rush. The way Blastoise's cannons are positioned on its shell, angled upward and backward to suggest propulsion as well as combat, carries an implied physics that makes the design feel considered. The way Gengar's smile is placed slightly asymmetric in certain sprite versions, giving it an expression that falls just outside the range of ordinary cheerfulness. The way Mewtwo's posture in its original sprite suggests a creature accustomed to being observed rather than one in the act of doing anything. These are not accidents. They are the result of artists thinking carefully about what these creatures should communicate, even when no one is looking closely. The sprite art of the early Pokémon games has been revisited extensively by fans and scholars of game design as examples of constrained visual communication at its most effective. Working within a resolution that would barely qualify as a thumbnail by modern standards, the artists created creatures that remained recognizable and characterful at their native scale, while also rewarding examination at larger sizes. The process of designing within severe technical constraints produces a specific kind of discipline where every pixel is a decision and nothing can be included without purpose. The sprites of Generation 1 and 2, particularly the gold and silver sprites, which used color in ways that the original Game Boy could not, represent a high-water mark of pixel art achievement within the franchise. The transition to three-dimensional models in Generation 6 represented the most significant visual shift in the franchise's history. The move from sprites to polygonal models changed the way individual Pokémon expressed personality during battle, introducing idle animations and movement patterns that gave each creature a visible behavioral language. Some players found the shift disorienting, preferring the specific way sprite art communicated character through suggestion rather than direct representation. Others embraced the new visual possibilities, which allowed for moves to be rendered with cinematic flair and for larger Pokémon to convey their scale in a way that two-dimensional sprites could only imply. The idle animations in the three-dimensional games have become a point of particular appreciation for attentive players. The way Mimikyu adjusts its disguise nervously when left in the party for a moment without input. The way Sylveon's feelers trace gentle arcs in the air during its idle cycle. The way Gengar's eyes briefly narrow into something more unsettling before returning to its default expression. These details are present in the game for players who pause and watch, and they communicate character information about each creature's personality that no Pokedex entry could fully convey in text. The music of each region is designed to carry the emotional character of that place, even before the player has spent enough time there to form their own associations. The calm domestic soundtrack of Pallet Town establishes the feeling of a small starting place, somewhere that the player will leave, but always feel the pull of returning to. The ascending urgency of the root themes suggests motion and possibility, the sensation of the world opening up as the player moves further from home. The gym themes maintain a consistent structure across generations while varying their instrumentation and intensity to reflect the personality of each individual challenge location. The battle themes carry the franchise's most consistently studied compositional tradition. Each layer of the game has its own battle theme, from wild encounters to trainer battles, to gym battles, to legendary encounters, to the final confrontation of the Elite Four and Champion sequence. The layering of these themes, each building on the tension of the previous, creates a musical arc that mirrors the journey's narrative arc. Players who have played through a complete mainline game carry these themes in a specific order in their memory, and hearing any one of them in isolation triggers the context of the others. The specific tonal quality of the Pokémon game music, which tends toward a kind of melodic optimism that reads as both childlike and genuinely affecting, has been analyzed by musicians and composers with a frequency that suggests genuine technical interest beyond nostalgia. The composers working within the limitations of the Game Boy's audio chip produced melodies that are instantly hummable and structurally sophisticated, achieving the combination of accessibility and depth that is the hallmark of truly excellent pop music composition. The music theory underlying tracks, like the Pokémon Red and Blue Route 1 theme, has been documented thoroughly by fans, and the harmonic choices are consistently more interesting than the genre would seem to require. The franchise's influence on the music production community has been extensive, with entire genres of electronic music drawing from the aesthetic and timbral qualities of early Pokémon game soundtracks. The lo-fi music community, in particular, has treated these soundtracks as a touchstone for a specific emotional quality associated with nostalgia, safety, and the ambient experience of being absorbed in a world that exists to be explored without urgency. The Pokémon music's function as a background for study and relaxation is something the franchise's creators have acknowledged and embraced through official releases of extended music mixes designed explicitly for listening while doing other things. The Pokémon franchise's relationship with its own history has become more explicitly nostalgic in recent years, with games like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and the Let's Go series representing a sustained engagement with the original games as objects of affection, rather than simply as source material for remakes. The Let's Go games in particular were designed to bridge the Pokémon Go community's experience with the mainline series, using the catching mechanic from Go as the primary encounter system and building the game around a region that would be familiar to players who had started with the original. The approach created a game that functioned as both an introduction and a homecoming. The nostalgia economy around Pokémon has produced a secondary market in original game cartridges, trading cards, merchandise, and collectibles that is genuinely significant in financial terms. Sealed copies of the original Pokémon Red and Blue and original holographic cards from the base set have sold at auction for sums that require specific explanation of why they command that price. The explanation involves the specific weight of childhood association, the way objects that were part of a particular era of individual life carry an emotional charge that makes their presence in physical form feel like a connection to something that would otherwise be irretrievable. The reproduction cartridge market for Game Boy Pokémon games created a landscape in which genuine original cartridges became increasingly difficult to authenticate without specific knowledge. Counterfeit versions of Pokémon Gold, Silver, Ruby, and Sapphire were produced in large quantities and sold through channels that did not distinguish them from originals. The community developed methods for identifying fakes, including examining the circuit board visible through the clear back of some carts, checking the battery compartment, and analyzing the save file behavior. This expertise, developed communally over years, represents a form of technical knowledge that exists nowhere in the franchise's official documentation. The battery-backed save data in the original Game Boy Pokémon games has a finite lifespan determined by the battery installed at the factory. The batteries in cartridges from the mid to late 1990s have been reaching the end of their operational life progressively over the past decade, creating a quiet erosion of the original saves that players spent hundreds of hours building. The discovery that a childhood save file has been lost to a dead battery is a specific kind of small grief that members of the community discuss with genuine feeling, a loss that is trivial in practical terms, but carries the weight of everything associated with those hours. The practice of battery replacement, which requires careful desoldering and resoldering of the battery contact inside the cartridge, has been documented extensively by the community as a way of preserving both the cartridge's functionality and, if the save file has not yet been lost, the data within it. Players who discover their battery is still functioning typically back up the save data using hardware flashers and software tools before replacing the battery, creating a digital archive of a childhood game that can be restored even after the physical medium has been repaired. The care taken in this process reflects the emotional significance of what is being preserved. The official Pokémon Home Service represents the franchise's current answer to the long-term storage and transfer question. As a cloud-based service, it offers theoretically indefinite storage for Pokémon from any game that supports it, and its ability to receive Pokémon from older games through the Pokémon Bank service created a migration path for creatures that had been stored on earlier generation hardware. The concern within the community about what happens to stored Pokémon if the service is discontinued reflects a real anxiety about digital permanence, the understanding that cloud-based services are ultimately dependent on the continued commercial viability of maintaining them. The concept of Pokémon that cannot legally be moved forward, creatures from older games that the home service cannot accept due to mechanical changes in more recent games that make their data incompatible, represents a kind of planned obsolescence built into the franchise's preservation infrastructure. Pokémon from certain older games exist in a state where they cannot be migrated forward, and the only way to have their equivalent in a current game is to catch or breed a new one. Players who spent significant time training specific individuals in older generations and who were unable to move them forward before the migration window closed carry specific memories of Pokémon that exist now only in hardware that may no longer function. The Pokémon Bank service, which bridged the gap between Generation 5 hardware and the cloud service era, had a specific closure date that prompted a period of intensive migration activity within the community as players raced to transfer their stored Pokémon before the service shut down. The coordination around this migration, with community members helping each other identify and move their most valued Pokémon in time, represented one of the more practically motivated collective efforts the community has engaged in. The memory of that period and the Pokémon that were and were not successfully migrated has become part of the community's shared narrative about the franchise's history. The hidden details in the overworld of Pokémon games have been documented by players with a thoroughness that the developers almost certainly did not anticipate. The specific arrangement of NPCs in towns, the cycling dialogue that changes based on in-game events, the books that can be read on shelves in houses, the computer terminals with readable text, the notice boards with posted messages, all of these constitute a body of world-building detail that accumulates over a complete playthrough into a portrait of a specific place. The most attentive players carry a detailed mental map of what exists in each game's world beyond the routes and dungeons that constitute the critical path. The Game Corner casinos, which appeared in multiple generations as a location where the player could win coins through slot machines and exchange them for prizes, including rare Pokémon and TMs, were eventually removed from games distributed in certain markets due to concerns about gambling mechanics in games aimed at children. The Game Corner had been a consistent presence in the franchise since the original games, and its removal created a visible difference between regional versions of specific games that players from different markets found disorienting. The alternative facilities introduced to replace the Game Corner varied in quality and were generally received less warmly than the mechanic they replaced. The Pokeathlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver presented yet another alternative activity alongside the main battle and contest systems, using the Nintendo DS touchscreen to create minigames that tested speed, accuracy, and pattern recognition. The Pokeathlon's performance metrics were tied to specific stat values in individual Pokémon, creating a system where training for Pokeathlon excellence partially overlapped with training for battle performance. The facility was praised for its use of the hardware's touch capabilities and for offering a physically engaging alternative to the turn-based combat that dominates the rest of the game. The Super Training feature introduced in X and Y provided a visual representation of the Eevee training process for the first time, allowing players to see their Pokemon's current Eevee distribution as a colored polygon and to improve specific stats through minigames. The transparency of the system changed the relationship between casual players and the competitive training process, making it possible for players without knowledge of the underlying number system to make meaningful improvements to their Pokemon's competitive potential. Later games refined this interface further, and the modern combination of visible Eevee displays and purchasable Eevee-enhancing items makes competitive preparation more accessible than it has ever been. The Pokemon Refresh feature, introduced in Sun and Moon as an evolution of the Pokemon Amy feature from X and Y, allowed players to pet, feed, and care for their Pokemon between battles. The level of detail in these interactions, with individual Pokemon responding differently to specific areas being touched and expressing preferences through animated reactions, gave the system a character depth that many players found genuinely engaging. Pokemon who were cared for in Refresh would occasionally perform in-battle actions suggestive of their affection for their trainer, including surviving attacks that should have knocked them out, shaking off status conditions through determination, and landing critical hits in moments of emotional connection. The in-battle dialogue that appears in later generations during significant moments, where the trainer encourages their Pokemon or the Pokemon responds to difficulty with renewed effort, reads as a quiet continuation of the franchise's central argument about the relationship between humans and Pokemon. The games have always presented this relationship as reciprocal rather than purely instrumental, and the moments in battle where this reciprocity is expressed through visible affection are designed to reinforce the emotional investment that makes the franchise's stakes feel real. The design philosophy behind the Pokemon world's human societies has been characterized by a consistent optimism about the relationship between people and Pokemon that functions almost as a political position within the game's world. The existence of Team Rocket, Team Plasma, and various other organizations that exploit or harm Pokemon is presented as aberrant rather than systemic, a violation of norms that are otherwise consistently maintained. The game worlds assume a baseline of benevolence in the relationship between humans and Pokemon that is periodically threatened but never fundamentally undermined, and the player's role as champion functions partly as a restoration of the natural order that the villainous organizations disrupted. This optimistic framework has been the subject of genuine philosophical discussion within the community, as players who think carefully about the game's world can identify ways in which the standard human Pokemon relationship, in which creatures are captured from the wild and trained for combat, might not be as uniformly positive as the games present it. The friction between the game's stated ethics and the mechanics through which those ethics are practiced is one of the most generative tensions in the franchise, and games like Black and White that engage with it directly are valued partly for their willingness to look at what the others preferred not to examine. The franchise's treatment of death varies significantly across its different media and across different moments within the games themselves. The canonical fate of the Lavender Town Marowak is one of the franchise's clearest engagements with Pokemon mortality, and it is treated with genuine gravity in the original games. The Ghost-type Pokemon generally are designed with awareness of the transition between life and death, and several of them are explicitly described as the spirits of deceased Pokemon or humans. Yet the games also use the polite fiction of Pokemon fainting rather than dying in battle, a convention that allows the games to engage with conflict and combat without requiring players to process the implications of what losing a battle actually means. The Nuzlocke Challenge, a fan-created rule set in which any Pokemon that faints in battle is treated as having died and must be released or placed permanently in a memorial box, was invented to reintroduce the emotional stakes that the fainting mechanic typically removes. Under Nuzlocke rules, every battle carries the possibility of genuine loss, and the accumulation of those losses across a playthrough creates a specific kind of narrative that varies with every run. The Nuzlocke Challenge produced some of the community's most beloved documented storytelling, with players sharing illustrated or written accounts of their runs that treated the Pokemon they encountered as characters with identities and histories. The proliferation of Nuzlocke variants has created a rich ecosystem of self-imposed challenge runs, each modifying the core rules in different ways to produce different experiences. The wedlock ties the survival of paired Pokemon together, so that if one partner dies, the other must be released. The Wonderlock replaces normal encounter rules with Wonder Trade results, introducing radical unpredictability into the team composition. The Egglock begins each encounter with a randomly selected egg rather than the wild Pokemon itself, maintaining the uncertainty of wild encounters while adding the emotional dimension of a Pokemon whose identity is unknown until it hatches. Each variant reflects a specific understanding of what makes the standard game emotionally compelling. The fan game community has produced an extraordinary range of Pokemon-inspired projects over the franchise's history, with fan-made games ranging from direct hacks of the original ROMs to entirely original games built on Pokemon game frameworks or from scratch. Fan games like Pokemon Insurgents, Pokemon Reborn, and Pokemon Uranium have built audiences of hundreds of thousands of players and have explored narrative territory, mechanical depth, and visual design that differ significantly from the mainline games. These projects represent genuine creative investment from their development teams, which in some cases were small groups of people who worked on their games for years before completion. The ROM hacking community has been central to the fan game ecosystem since the early days of the franchise. Tools developed by community members allow creators to modify the original game's data to change encounter tables, move pools, maps, dialogue, and music, creating experiences that use the original engine while telling entirely new stories. The most celebrated ROM hacks have been recognized by the community as works of genuine creative merit, and their authors have occasionally gone on to work in commercial game development. The skills developed through ROM hacking, including programming, visual design, music composition, and narrative design, are transferable to professional contexts. The Pokemon fan art community has produced a volume of original creative work that is genuinely difficult to quantify. Every platform with a visual art community contains Pokemon fan work, and the range of approaches, From faithful species studies to radically reimagined character redesigns, from painted portraiture to architectural and ecological world building, reflects the breadth of creative engagement the franchise inspires. Artists who grew up with Pokémon have carried the designs forward into their own practice, and the creatures that Ken Sugimori originally drew for a Game Boy game now exist in every visual language imaginable. The relationship between official Pokémon merchandise and fan-created goods has been a recurring point of tension, with the Pokémon Company's aggressive protection of its intellectual property creating situations where fan-made goods were removed from online marketplaces that had hosted them without issue for years. The community's response to these enforcement actions has been varied, with some members accepting the legal necessity, and others feeling that the franchise's relationship with its creative community was being damaged by overly broad enforcement. The conversation about where official enforcement ends and fan creative expression begins has not been resolved and is unlikely to reach a permanent resolution. The Pokémon community's capacity to generate and sustain sub-communities around highly specific interests is one of its most distinctive characteristics. There are communities dedicated to single Pokémon species, to specific competitive formats, to specific games or generations, to the lore of specific regions, to the history of development and design, to shiny hunting, to Nuzlocke runs, to fan fiction, to fan games, to trading, to speedrunning, to glitch hunting, and to academic analysis of the franchise's cultural significance. Each of these communities has produced its own body of knowledge and its own culture, and the connections between them form a web that is genuinely complex. The specific Pokémon that players choose as their personal favorites carry a weight of association that the franchise has cultivated deliberately through its design approach. The variety of body types, aesthetic sensibilities, and conceptual framings in the Pokémon roster ensures that nearly any player can find something that resonates with their specific preferences. A player drawn to elegant designs can find dozens of Pokémon whose visual appeal is defined by grace and flow. A player who prefers powerful and imposing creatures can find an equally extensive selection. A player who responds to strange and uncanny designs, to Pokémon whose existence raises questions rather than answering them, will find that the roster contains entire corners dedicated to exactly that sensibility. The Pokémon that players bond with in their first playthrough carry a specific emotional charge that later Pokémon often struggle to match in the same way, not because they are inferior, but because the relationship established with the first ever team occurs during a particular window of openness and novelty. Players who remember their first starter's name, their first caught Pokémon, the first unexpected encounter that startled them, or the first legendary that took them dozens of attempts to catch, are remembering not just the game, but themselves in the act of encountering it. The Pokémon are inseparable from the memory of that moment. The concept of a signature Pokémon, a creature so associated with a specific character in the game that the two become synonymous in the memory of the player, is one of the design elements that the games have used most effectively. Lance's Dragonite, Cynthia's Garchomp, Steven's Metagross, Wallace's Melodic, and N's Zoroark are all examples of this principle working at its most effective, where the creature and its trainer create a combined impression that is stronger than either would be in isolation. The design of these pairings involves matching the trainer's personality and aesthetic to a Pokémon whose design and type communicate the same qualities in visual form. The champion's room in each game is designed to function as a final destination, a space that communicates both grandeur and finality. The approach through the Elite Four, each room serving as a threshold through which the player passes into more intense territory, builds a sense of progression that makes the champion's room feel earned when it is finally reached. The music that plays there, distinct from the battle music that follows, creates a brief moment of suspension before the confrontation begins, a last moment of silence before the climax of everything the game has been building toward. The credits sequence of each Pokemon game performs a retrospective of the journey that has just ended, scrolling through locations and trainers encountered along the way against music that reflects on the experience with a tone of earned completion. The first time a player watches a Pokemon game's credits, having finished the story they began with their starter Pokemon, is a specific experience that does not fully repeat even in subsequent playthroughs. The combination of accomplishment and mild melancholy at the journey's end is one of the franchise's most consistently delivered emotional beats, and it is the feeling that makes players begin again. The post-credits content in modern Pokemon games has expanded to include substantial additional story, in some cases still exceeding the length of the main narrative. The post-game stories in Sun and Moon, in Black and White 2, and in Scarlet and Violet all provided significant narrative payoffs that recontextualized events from the main story and introduced characters or resolutions that the main story had deliberately left incomplete. Players who stop playing when the credits roll are experiencing a different game than those who continue, and the franchise has increasingly built its most emotionally resonant content into the space after the first ending. The tradition of post-game legendary encounters, in which powerful Pokemon previously inaccessible become available after the main story is completed, creates an ongoing incentive that keeps players engaged with the game world beyond its narrative resolution. These encounters often come with their own context, brief lore that explains why the legendary was waiting for someone strong enough to find it, and the act of pursuing them after having completed the main story has a different character than the story's core progression. There is no urgency. There is only the space of the world and the creatures still within it, waiting. The ending state of a completed Pokemon game, in which the player has defeated the champion, explored every accessible location, caught every available Pokemon, and built a team that reflects hundreds of hours of care and consideration, is one of the most personal documents that a video game can produce. No two completed Pokemon games are alike, because no two players make the same choices about which creatures to raise, which strategies to invest in, which corners of the world to spend time in. The completed game is a portrait of the person who played it, and it exists only as long as the hardware that runs it continues to function and the electricity that powers it continues to flow. The Pokemon that inhabit each region are described in their Pokedex entries as having specific territorial behaviors, feeding patterns, and relationships with other species that collectively suggest an ecology rather than a simple collection of creatures. Bidoof builds its dams in rivers using materials gathered from surrounding forests, and its presence in an area indicates access to both woodland and water. Wurmple splits into two possible evolutionary paths based on a hidden personality value, with no external indication of which path will be taken, and the randomness of this branching reflects the genuine unpredictability of biological development. Nincada lives underground for years before emerging to evolve, and the timing of its emergence corresponds to specific temperature and moisture conditions in its environment. The attention to ecological plausibility in Pokemon design is most visible in the relationships between predator and prey species, which exist implicitly throughout the franchise without ever being foregrounded. Caterpie and its line exist as prey animals in the ecosystem of the Kanto forests, and the design choices that gave them defensive mechanisms like string shot are consistent with real-world caterpillar biology. Swellow is a predatory bird whose territory overlaps with smaller Pokemon species, and its aggressive behavior toward intruders described in the Pokedex is consistent with the territorial behavior of real raptors. These implicit relationships give the game worlds a texture of biological coherence that rewards ecological thinking. The Pokémon world's geography, when examined carefully, suggests a planet that is similar to Earth, but with significant differences in its distribution of habitable land and ocean. The regions explored across the mainline games are described as being part of a single larger world, and in-universe references between regions establish their relative positions and the trade and communication networks that connect them. The world is not exhaustively mapped in any game, and the existence of unexplored regions is implied regularly, giving the sense that the settings players explore are only a portion of a much larger world with its own undiscovered corners. The in-game maps of each region are stylized representations rather than geographically accurate documents, and the actual physical scale of the routes and towns is deliberately left ambiguous. Players moving between cities in real-world analogs to geographically significant distances do so in seconds of game time, and the relationship between in-game time and real-world time is inconsistent across different activities. This deliberate ambiguity about scale is characteristic of the game genre and allows the world to feel both intimate in terms of the density of its emotional content and vast in terms of the sense of distance and exploration it conveys. The Pokémon world's economics, when examined through the items available in shops and the wages earned from trainer battles, suggest a world in which the economy is structured around Pokémon in ways that go beyond simple ownership. Berries and held items are clearly produced and distributed through agricultural and commercial networks. The existence of berry masters, move tutors, and specialized breeders suggests a professional ecosystem around Pokémon care and training. The pricing of items in Pokémon centers and marts, which has remained relatively stable across generations while the available items have expanded dramatically, suggests an in-world economic stability that is never threatened even by the catastrophic events of the main stories. The technology of the Pokémon world has expanded significantly in the modern games, with smartphones, wireless communication, and streaming services appearing alongside the traditional Pokémon Center and Pokéball technologies. The coexistence of apparently pre-industrial elements, hand-drawn cave paintings, stone ruins, traditional crafts, with advanced communication infrastructure reflects a world that developed technologically along different lines than Earth. The specific technology of Pokeball miniaturization, which allows living creatures to be stored in devices small enough to carry on a belt, is never explained mechanically in the games, and the few in-world references to how it works are suggestive rather than definitive. The lore around the creation of the Pokeball technology is distributed across multiple games and media and suggests a complex history of development from cruder containment technologies to the sophisticated modern devices. The apricorn-based balls of the Johto region represent an earlier phase of Pokeball development, and the specific properties of different apricorn types determining the catch rate modifications of the resulting balls suggests an empirically developed body of knowledge about Pokeball engineering. The industrial standardization of the Pokeball into the familiar red and white spheres represents a later phase in which craft knowledge was replaced by mass production. The attention to the in-world history of technology and culture gives the Pokémon games a depth that accumulates across playthroughs and across the franchise's generations. Players who began with the original games and have played every mainline title since carry a sense of the world's history that no single game provides completely. The Pokémon franchise rewards continuity of engagement in a way that few entertainment franchises can match, because each new game adds to the understanding of a world that has been growing more detailed for nearly 3 decades, and there is always something still not yet found, still waiting in the tall grass. The specific location of certain wild Pokémon, available only in one small patch of grass in one corner of one route, creates a geography of desire that players navigate without always being aware of it. The Phoebus in Generation 3 catchable only in 6 specific tiles of the river route in Hoenn, became one of the franchise's most discussed optional encounters because the conditions of finding it were so precisely constrained. The tiles changed each day based on the trendy phrase set in Lavender Town, and without knowledge of the current tiles, fishing in the wrong location produced nothing of interest indefinitely. Players who found Phoebus by accident rather than by knowledge almost always remember exactly where they were when it happened. The transformation of Phoebus into Melodic, which required raising its beauty stat to maximum through the contest system rather than through simple leveling, created an evolution pathway that was more about the game's secondary systems than its primary combat system. The investment required to evolve Phoebus was substantial, involving feeding specific Poffin or Pokeblock items to raise the beauty condition, and the design choice reflected a specific value in the game's ecology, where the most visually beautiful Pokémon required the most care and attention to achieve. This is among the franchise's most direct expressions of the idea that beauty requires cultivation. The Pokémon Jirachi, a mythical creature associated with wishes and with stars, could be obtained in Generation 3 only through a bonus disc distributed with Pokémon Colosseum in certain markets. The disc created one of the most elaborate distribution events in the franchise's history, requiring players to own the GameCube game and to connect their Game Boy Advance to it with a specific cable. The specificity of this requirement meant that many players who wanted Jirachi could not obtain it through legitimate means, and it remained one of the most sought-after mythicals of its generation for years. Its eventual availability through Pokémon Home and later releases made it accessible to all players, but the memory of its original inaccessibility remains part of the creature's cultural biography. The distribution of mythical Pokémon through special events has been one of the franchise's most consistent sources of community frustration and excitement simultaneously. The excitement comes from the exclusivity and the narrative significance of the creatures being distributed. The frustration comes from the geographical and temporal restrictions that have historically limited access to players who could not attend specific physical locations at specific times. The shift toward online and serial code distributions in later generations addressed much of this frustration while losing some of the special event atmosphere that made the earlier distributions memorable. The Deoxys distribution in the United States required attendance at a Nintendo World Store event in New York City or at specific Toys R Us locations on specific dates, creating an event that was simultaneously a piece of official franchise history and a geographical barrier for players in rural areas or in other countries. The players who obtained their Deoxys through these events carry a memory of the experience that includes the location, the date, and the other players they encountered there, a social dimension of Pokémon ownership that digital distribution cannot replicate. The mystery gift system, which facilitates the distribution of special Pokémon and items, has its origins in Generation 2's system for connecting two players wirelessly to exchange items. The original mystery gift, in gold and silver, required players to physically connect their Game Boys and stand within range of each other, creating a social interaction as a prerequisite for accessing the feature. The expansion of this system across generations, from local wireless to event cards to online serial codes, traces the history of how the franchise adapted to changing communication technology while maintaining the underlying concept of special items distributed through social connection. The Wonder Card system in later games, which recorded a history of mystery gift items received, created a collectible dimension to the distribution system beyond the items themselves. Players who had received every available mystery gift for a specific game carried a collection of Wonder Cards that functioned as a record of their participation in the game's official event history. The aesthetic design of Wonder Cards varied by event and occasionally by region. and collectors who valued the completeness of this record treated the preservation of Wonder Cards with the same care as the Pokémon they delivered. The franchise's management of time-limited content, where certain items or Pokémon are available only during a specific window, has always created a two-tier community between those who participated and those who did not. The gap between players who obtained specific event Pokémon at the time of their distribution and those who did not has narrowed over time as the franchise has become more willing to redistribute previously exclusive content through later events and services. But certain Pokémon remain genuinely unavailable to players who do not have access to specific older hardware and games, creating pockets of irreversible exclusivity within the collection. The specific way that certain Pokémon moves interact with the game's physics has produced some of the most discussed edge cases in competitive history. The move Protect, which blocks all incoming damage for one turn, but becomes increasingly likely to fail with repeated consecutive use, creates a specific risk-reward calculation that is present in nearly every high-level battle. The decision of whether to use Protect on any given turn involves reading the opponent's intent, estimating the probability of a specific incoming attack, and weighing the cost of the potential failure against the benefit of the turn of safety. This single-move decision tree has produced an entire vocabulary of plays and counterplays that experienced competitive players navigate intuitively. The move Earthquake is among the franchise's most strategically significant, dealing damage to every Pokémon on the field in doubles battles, except those with the ability Levitate or those that are airborne through other means. Its widespread distribution across species, its ground typing that hits many common threats super effectively, and its broad field coverage in doubles make it both a powerful offensive tool and a source of constant consideration when building teams. Partners that are weak to Earthquake are a liability to any team that wants to use the move, and finding Pokémon that provide offensive coverage while not creating Earthquake problems is one of the standard challenges of doubles team building. The interaction between the moves Skill Swap, Role Play, and Trace, and the abilities they can transfer, has produced some of the most creatively exploitative team strategies in competitive history. Abilities designed to be passive and defensive can be passed to Pokémon that benefit from them in unexpected ways, and abilities designed for specific Pokémon can be removed and redistributed to create unusual interactions with moves and items. The depth of this ability transfer mechanic, which the developers could not have fully anticipated, reflects how combinatorially complex the ability system became as more abilities were added across generations. The held item economy in competitive Pokémon has its own distinct logic that runs parallel to the type and move considerations that dominate most discussions of team building. The choice of held item for each Pokémon on a team involves understanding which opponents the Pokémon is most likely to face, which situations it is most likely to encounter, and what the team most needs in terms of additional resources. The choice between a speed-boosting scarf, a power-boosting band or specs, and a survival-oriented rocky helmet or focus sash represents a fundamental decision about how each Pokémon's role within the team is defined, and changing the item can change the role as dramatically as changing any other aspect of the set. The Focus Sash item, which allows a Pokémon to survive any single hit that would otherwise knock it out in one blow, has been one of the most strategically important items since its introduction. Its interaction with moves that deal damage proportional to the target's remaining HP, moves that strike multiple times in sequence, and weather-based end-of-turn damage that removes the Sash's effect before it can be used, created a web of interactions that made the item both powerful and exploitable. Teams built around Focus Sash users required specific management of hazards and weather that changed the structure of the overall team composition. The entry hazard mechanic, in which certain moves set traps on the opponent's side of the field that damage Pokémon switching in, introduced a layer of positional strategy in Generation 4 that changed the nature of team building at every level of play. Stealth Rock, which deals percentage damage based on the target's weakness to rock-type moves, became the most universally deployed entry hazard in competitive history, and the ability to set it reliably became one of the primary factors in evaluating support Pokémon. The corresponding ability to remove hazards through moves like Rapid Spin and Defog created a subgame of hazard setting and removal that runs throughout competitive matches without ever appearing in the turn-by-turn damage dealt. The weather mechanics interaction with entry hazards created team structures in which players needed to manage both the battlefield condition and the hazard state simultaneously, with each turn's decision potentially affecting both. The Pokémon that could set hazards, summon weather, and provide other forms of team support while remaining useful in direct combat became enormously valuable, and the search for Pokémon that could fulfill multiple support roles efficiently drove a significant portion of the analysis work done by the competitive community in each new generation. The most valued supportive Pokémon in any given generation are those that provide the most useful services per team slot occupied. The concept of pivoting, in which a Pokémon uses a move that deals damage and then forces it to switch out immediately, was introduced through the moves Volt Switch and U-Turn, and fundamentally changed how momentum was managed in competitive play. A pivot move allows the user to deal damage, remove itself from a dangerous position, and bring in the next Pokémon under favorable conditions, all in a single action. The value of this combined action is so high that Pokémon with access to pivot moves and appropriate stats have been among the most commonly used in competitive formats across many generations. The Pokémon franchise has given multiple generations of players a specific kind of imaginative space, one that is structured enough to feel coherent and open enough to feel genuinely exploratory. The games provide goals without commanding urgency, worlds without prescribed paths through them, creatures without exhaustive explanations of what they are. The result is a form of play that accommodates the pace of the individual player, never hurrying, always presenting more to discover for those who look. The franchise's longevity is partly a function of this quality, the sense that the world contains more than any single engagement with it will fully reveal. The details scattered across the Pokémon games and their surrounding media are there for the players who slow down long enough to notice them. They are the franchise's quiet promise that attention is rewarded, that the world it has built is dense enough to sustain curiosity indefinitely. For a series that began as a way of recreating the feeling of searching for something alive in an environment that had stopped containing it, this may be the most fitting thing about it. The world of Pokémon continues to contain things to find. It has always contained more than it shows at first. The franchise's most enduring quality may simply be that it was designed by someone who understood what it felt like to search, to find, and to carry what was found carefully home. That understanding is present in every generation, in every creature, in every detail placed quietly where it will be discovered only by those who are looking. What the Pokémon franchise has built across its decades of existence is not simply a collection of games, but a shared space that exists in the minds of the people who have inhabited it. The roots and towns of Kanto and Johto, and Hoenn and Sinnoh, and Unova, and Kalos, and Alola, and Galar, and Paldea are not merely locations in game data. They are places that people have returned to, in memory and in playthrough, across years and decades. The Pokémon that people trained and lost, and found and trained again, carry associations that are entirely personal and yet find resonance in the shared experience of a community that played the same games at different times and different places and felt, somehow, the same things. The details that most players never notice are not lesser for being unseen. They exist in the game for the moments when they are found, The afternoon that someone reads every book on every shelf in Celadon City and discovers the quiet message hidden in a stack of adventure stories. The evening that someone pauses in front of an NPC they have passed 100 times and reads new dialogue that rewrites their understanding of a character they thought they knew. These moments are small. They cost nothing. They take nothing from the players who never encounter them, and they give something quiet and lasting to those who do. The world of Pokémon continues to expand, each new generation adding creatures and places and stories to a body of work that began with a Game Boy cartridge in a language most of its eventual audience could not read. The expansion has changed things. Some of what made the early games feel specific has been smoothed over by the scale of what the franchise has become, but the impulse at the center of it has not changed. The desire to find something in the world that you did not expect to be there, to reach into the tall grass and feel the small shock of encountering something alive. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.